The first thing I noticed when I pulled into my parents' driveway was the sound of laughter coming from the backyard. It wasn't even 9 o'clock in the morning. Colorful balloons swayed gently in the warm summer breeze while strings of white lights had already been wrapped around the wooden fence. A large banner stretched across the patio. "Happy 31st birthday, Sophie." I smiled to myself, grabbed the 2 trays of homemade pastries I'd baked the night before, and walked toward the house. The front door was unlocked, just as it always was whenever our family hosted a gathering. "Mom," I called. "In the kitchen," she answered. I carried the trays inside and found her standing over a pot of homemade pasta sauce. Every burner on the stove was occupied, and the kitchen counters were covered with vegetables waiting to be chopped. "There you are," she said with a relieved smile. I was starting to worry. "I said I'd be here early." "I know." She looked at the pastry trays. "You made those too?" "They're Sophie's favorite." Mom smiled warmly. "She'll love them." Without another word, I slipped on an apron and began slicing vegetables while Mom stirred the sauce. We had done this together so many times over the years that neither of us needed to ask who was responsible for what. The work simply flowed. Within an hour, the backyard looked ready for a magazine cover. I arranged flowers on every table, carried extra chairs from the garage, filled coolers with drinks, and checked the speakers before the first guests arrived. Nobody had asked me to do any of it. I just knew it needed to be done. Around noon, cars began filling the driveway. Uncles, aunts, cousins, neighbors. Everyone entered carrying wrapped presents and cheerful smiles. "Sophie's going to love this party," Aunt Linda said as she admired the decorations. "She's always had such wonderful taste." I smiled politely and continued arranging plates on the buffet table. A few minutes later, Sophie finally came downstairs wearing a bright blue summer dress. The entire room erupted into applause. "There she is. Birthday girl. You look gorgeous." She laughed and hugged everyone one by one. To her credit, Sophie never demanded attention. She simply attracted it without trying. When she noticed me standing near the dining table, she walked over and hugged me tightly. "You did all this, didn't you? We both know you'd have done the same for me." She smiled. "I probably would have hired someone." I laughed. "That's also true." She squeezed my hand before greeting another wave of relatives. Watching her move effortlessly from conversation to conversation, I couldn't help smiling. She had always been outgoing. I had always been quieter. There was nothing wrong with either of us. The difference was that one personality naturally filled a room. The other quietly held it together. Just 3 days earlier, I'd received the biggest promotion of my career. After nearly 9 years with the same financial consulting firm, I had been named Senior Portfolio Director. It was a position I'd worked countless late nights to earn. My phone was still filled with congratulatory messages from co-workers. I hadn't mentioned it to many relatives. I assumed someone had told my parents. But as conversations drifted around the backyard, nobody asked how work was going. Nobody mentioned the promotion. Instead, they laughed about Sophie's latest travel adventure and her plans to renovate the cottage she had recently purchased. I quietly refilled empty drink pitchers and carried another tray of food outside. Today wasn't about me. I reminded myself of that more than once. Still, somewhere deep inside, I couldn't help wondering whether anyone would ever notice the daughter who always arrived first, stayed last, and somehow managed to disappear in between. By the time dinner was ready, the backyard was glowing beneath strands of warm white lights. The long wooden table was covered with homemade food, birthday flowers, and wrapped presents stacked neatly beside Sophie's chair. Everyone seemed relaxed. Children chased each other across the lawn while my uncles argued good-naturedly over baseball scores. Laughter drifted through the evening air as glasses were filled and plates passed around the table. For a while, I simply enjoyed watching everyone together. Mom sat beside Sophie, helping her open birthday cards. Dad was telling one of his favorite stories for what had to be the 100th time. It felt peaceful. Then Dad slowly stood, lifting his wine glass. I'd like everyone's attention for a minute. The conversations faded almost immediately. He smiled proudly at Sophie. "First of all, happy birthday. Everyone echoed the greeting before raising their glasses. Sophie laughed. "Thank you." Everyone. Dad looked around the table. "Watching my girls grow into such wonderful women has been the greatest privilege of my life." I smiled quietly. Then he continued, "You reach a certain age where you start thinking about the future." His tone became more thoughtful. "Your mother and I have spent the last year organizing our estate." Several relatives nodded with interest. "We've made some important decisions." I noticed Mom glance toward me before lowering her eyes. Something about her expression felt different. Dad rested one hand on Sophie's shoulder. "When the time comes." He smiled warmly. "The family house, the lake cabin, and the family business will all belong to Sophie." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Aunt Linda smiled. "That makes perfect sense." A few others nodded in agreement. Sophie's smile disappeared. "Dad." He gently squeezed her shoulder. "Let me finish." She sat back quietly. Dad turned toward me. "Olivia." His voice softened. "You've always been responsible." I forced a small smile. "You've built a wonderful career. You've always known how to take care of yourself." He looked around the table again. "Sophie has a different path. She'll need more support." Several relatives murmured their agreement. Dad continued as though everything he was saying were perfectly natural. "We're not doing this because we love one daughter more. We're doing it because Olivia will always be able to stand on her own feet." Someone across the table smiled at me. "That's true. She's always been independent." Another relative added, "She's the strong one." Strong. Responsible. Independent. The words were meant as compliments. Yet somehow, they felt like reasons to be forgotten. I looked toward Sophie. She seemed deeply uncomfortable. "Dad." She spoke carefully. "I don't think this is the right time." He waved his hand dismissively. "It's important everyone understands our wishes." Then he raised his glass again. "To Sophie. The future of everything this family has built." The table erupted into applause. I joined in. Not because my heart wasn't breaking. Because I refused to let my sister's birthday become a memory filled with bitterness. When the applause finally faded, I reached across the table and smiled at Sophie. "Congratulations." She looked at me with sadness in her eyes. She didn't know what to say. Neither did I. I quietly finished my dinner while conversations resumed around me. No one noticed how silent I had become. No one noticed that I hadn't touched the birthday cake. And no one realized that while they believed my parents had just decided the family's future, the greatest part of Grandpa's legacy had never been sitting at this table in the first place. By the time dessert was served, I had already decided to leave. No one noticed. My aunt was passing around slices of birthday cake while my cousins gathered near the fire pit, laughing over old family stories. Sophie's presents were piled beside her chair, and Dad was proudly explaining his plans for expanding the lake cabin over the next few years. It felt strange listening to him speak about a future he believed had already been settled. I quietly carried a stack of empty plates into the kitchen, washed my hands, and returned to the dining room. "I'm going to head home," I said. Mom looked surprised. "So early?" "I've got an early meeting tomorrow." She nodded sympathetically. "I understand." She hugged me before I reached for my purse. "Drive safely." "I will." Dad barely looked up from his conversation with Uncle Richard. "Good night, Liv." "Good night, Dad." Sophie followed me to the front porch. "I'm sorry." I turned toward her. "For what?" "You know." She glanced back toward the dining room. "I didn't know he was going to say all that." "I believe you. I don't want you thinking I asked for any of it." I smiled softly. "I know you didn't." She hesitated. "You okay?" For a brief moment, I considered telling her how much the evening had hurt. Instead, I simply nodded. "I will be." She hugged me tightly. "I love you." "I love you too." Then I climbed into my car and quietly drove away. Instead of turning toward my apartment, I headed north. The roads became quieter as the city lights disappeared behind me. 20 minutes later, I pulled into the small cemetery where Grandpa had been buried 3 years earlier. The gates were still open. The grounds were peaceful beneath the fading evening sky. I carried no flowers. Grandpa had never cared much for them. He always said conversations mattered more. I slowly walked toward the old oak tree where his headstone rested. The grass had been freshly cut. Someone had already placed a small American flag beside the stone. I smiled. That was probably Mr. Jenkins, the caretaker Grandpa used to drink coffee with every Saturday morning. I sat quietly beside the headstone. "Hi, Grandpa." The words felt natural. They always had. For several minutes, I simply listened to the breeze moving through the trees. Then I reached into my purse. Hidden inside a small leather pouch was a cream-colored envelope. The paper had begun to yellow with age, but Grandpa's handwriting remained perfectly clear. For Olivia. Beneath my name, written in smaller letters, was a single instruction. Open only after the family chooses its future. I gently traced the ink with my fingertips. 3 years earlier, Grandpa had placed the envelope into my hands while lying in a hospital bed. "Promise me something," he had whispered. "Anything. No matter what happens after I'm gone. Don't open this early." "Why?" He had smiled the same quiet smile he always wore whenever he already knew the answer to a question. "Because timing changes everything." I had promised him. And I had never broken that promise. Tonight, for the first time, I wondered whether the moment he had been waiting for had finally arrived. I stared at the envelope for several seconds before carefully slipping it back into the leather pouch without breaking the seal. "If today's what you meant." I looked toward the fading sunset. "I trust you'll let me know." As I stood to leave, I glanced back one last time at Grandpa's headstone. For years, everyone believed the family's greatest inheritance was the house, the cabin, or the business. Only Grandpa had known the truth. And somehow, he had trusted only me to protect it until the time was right. By the time I reached my apartment, the city had grown quiet. The streets below my building glowed beneath rows of yellow streetlights while a light summer rain began tapping softly against the windows. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It wasn't a large apartment. Just a small one-bedroom on the 7th floor with hardwood floors, a comfortable sofa, and shelves lined with books I'd collected over the years. Everything inside had been purchased slowly, one paycheck at a time. Nothing had been handed to me, and somehow, that made every corner feel like home. I slipped off my shoes, placed my purse on the kitchen counter, and stood in the silence for a moment. The evening replayed itself in my mind. Dad raising his glass. The applause. The way everyone had nodded as though the decision made perfect sense. "Olivia will be fine. She's always been independent. She'll make it on her own." For years, those words had sounded like compliments. Tonight, they sounded different. They were excuses, not reasons. I walked into my bedroom and opened the top drawer of my dresser. Most people would have seen nothing unusual. Folded sweaters. A jewelry box. Old family photographs. Beneath them sat a small steel lockbox. I entered the combination from memory and slowly lifted the lid. Inside were several neatly organized folders. Investment statements. Legal documents. Property records. Letters from attorneys. And resting on top of everything, Grandpa's sealed envelope. Still unopened. I picked it up carefully. The paper had become softer with age, but the seal remained untouched. Beside it rested another envelope addressed to a law firm. That one had already been opened years ago. Not because I had wanted to, because Grandpa's attorney had instructed me to. Inside had been only one sentence. "Follow every instruction exactly as your grandfather requested." Nothing more. No explanation. No hint. Only trust. I gently placed both envelopes back inside the lockbox. For a moment, I looked at the investment statements beneath them. Every document had been carefully updated over the years. Every responsibility Grandpa had quietly entrusted to me had been managed exactly as he had taught me. Patiently. Carefully. Without seeking recognition. I closed the lid and locked the box once again. Then I carried a cup of tea to the living room and stood beside the window overlooking the city. Thousands of lights stretched across the skyline. Behind every one of them was someone carrying hopes, disappointments, dreams, or regrets. Mine suddenly felt lighter. Not because tonight hadn't hurt. It had. More than I wanted to admit. But somewhere between leaving my parents' house and sitting beside Grandpa's grave, I had realized something important. I couldn't control whether my parents ever truly understood my worth. I never could. What I could control was the life I built from this moment forward. I smiled quietly at my reflection in the glass. I won't spend another year trying to earn a place in someone else's heart. The words settled over the room like a promise. I'll build a life I'm proud to live. Outside, the rain continued falling gently against the windows. Somewhere across town, my family believed they had settled the future with one announcement around a dinner table. They had no idea that the greatest legacy Grandpa had ever created had never been the house, the cabin, or the family business. For 3 years, the biggest secret in our family had quietly been sitting inside my apartment. And I was the only person who knew it even existed. The weeks after Sophie's birthday settled into something that looked ordinary from the outside. I went back to work Monday morning. My inbox was overflowing, 3 client meetings filled my calendar, and a quarterly presentation was waiting on my desk. Life hadn't stopped simply because my heart had been bruised. In many ways, I was grateful for that. Work had always given me something my childhood rarely had. A clear connection between effort and outcome. If I stayed late, projects improved. If I prepared well, clients trusted me. If I made mistakes, I learned from them. There were no favorites. Only results. That was one of the reasons I loved my career. 2 days after the family dinner, my assistant knocked gently on my office door. "They're ready for you." I looked up from my notes. "Already?" She smiled. "The board has been waiting." I carried my presentation folder into the conference room where 12 executives were seated around a long walnut table. Some had worked in finance for 30 years. Others had joined the company only recently. The moment I began speaking, every conversation stopped. For the next 40 minutes, no one interrupted me. No one spoke over me. No one compared me to someone else. They simply listened. When the presentation ended, our CEO closed his notebook and smiled. "Excellent work, Olivia. Thank you. The investment strategy you proposed will likely save this company millions over the next decade." Around the table, several executives nodded in agreement. One of them leaned forward. "You've become one of the strongest leaders in this organization." The compliment caught me off guard. Not because I didn't appreciate it. Because I wasn't used to hearing words like that. Growing up, achievements were usually followed by another expectation. Another comparison. Another reminder that someone else had done something bigger. Here, success was simply acknowledged. Nothing more. Nothing less. After the meeting, my colleague Marcus caught up with me near the elevators. "Celebrating tonight?" I laughed. "Celebrating what?" "Your promotion." "I've been too busy working." He shook his head. "That's exactly why we're celebrating." Before I could object, he continued. "A few of us are grabbing dinner after work. You should come." I hesitated. "I don't know." Marcus smiled knowingly. "You've spent years taking care of everyone else. It's okay to let people celebrate you once in a while." His words stayed with me all afternoon. That evening, I found myself sitting in a small Italian restaurant surrounded by co-workers who had become genuine friends. Nobody talked about inheritances. Nobody cared whose parents were proud. They laughed about office stories, vacation plans, and embarrassing presentation mistakes we'd all survived together. At one point, the waitress placed a small dessert in front of me. "Congratulations," she said. I looked around the table. "You planned this?" Marcus grinned. "You earned it." Everyone applauded. It wasn't loud. It wasn't extravagant. But it was sincere. Driving home later that night, I realized something that hadn't occurred to me before. For years, I had searched for validation inside my family. Without even noticing, I had slowly built another family. Not by blood, but through kindness, respect, and shared trust. And for the first time in a very long while, I didn't feel nearly as alone as I once had. The months passed quietly. Work became busier than ever, but I didn't mind. Every new project challenged me in ways I genuinely enjoyed. Some evenings I stayed at the office until long after the lights in neighboring buildings had gone dark, not because anyone expected me to, but because I believed in what I was building. For the first time in my life, my effort wasn't measured against someone else's success. It stood on its own. One Thursday morning, I was reviewing investment reports when my phone buzzed. Mom calling. I stared at the screen for a moment before answering. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, sweetheart." Her voice sounded unusually hesitant. "Am I interrupting work?" "I've got a few minutes." She paused. "I just wanted to see how you've been." I smiled faintly. "I've been good. Still working too much?" "Probably." She laughed softly. "Some things never change." There was another long silence. Neither of us seemed to know where the conversation should go. Finally she asked, "Will you be coming for Sunday dinner?" I leaned back in my chair. "I wasn't planning on it." "I understand." Her answer came quicker than I expected. "I just thought I'd ask." Before hanging up, she quietly added, "Your father misses you." I didn't know how to respond. Not because I didn't believe her, because hearing those words felt unfamiliar. After we ended the call, I sat staring at the city skyline outside my office window. Did he really miss me? Or did he simply miss having the dependable daughter who always showed up? I couldn't tell. Maybe neither could he. That evening, I stopped by my favorite neighborhood bookstore before heading home. It had become a small tradition after difficult weeks. The owner, Mrs. Bennett, recognized me the moment I walked through the door. "Long week." I laughed. "Is it that obvious? You always buy mystery novels after stressful meetings." "I guess I've become predictable." She smiled. "Not predictable. Comforting." While browsing the shelves, I noticed an elderly gentleman struggling to reach a book on the highest shelf. Without thinking, I walked over. "Would you like some help?" "I'd appreciate it." I handed him the book. "Thank you." He looked at the title and smiled. "My wife loved this author." "I'm sorry." He nodded gently. "It's been 3 years." For a few minutes we talked about books, travel, and retirement. Before leaving, he shook my hand. "My name's Harold." "I'm Olivia. You remind me of someone." "Who?" "My daughter." He smiled warmly. "She always notices the people everyone else walks past." His words stayed with me all the way home. Grandpa used to say something similar. Character isn't revealed by how people treat important guests. It's revealed by how they treat ordinary strangers. That lesson had shaped far more of my life than anyone realized. When I arrived home, I checked the mailbox in the apartment lobby. Among the usual bills and advertisements was a cream-colored envelope. No return address. Only my name written neatly across the front. The handwriting instantly stopped me. I knew it. I'd seen it dozens of times before. It belonged to Mr. Charles Whitmore, Grandpa's attorney. My heart began beating a little faster. He hadn't contacted me in almost 3 years. I slipped the envelope into my bag without opening it. Somehow, I already knew this wasn't an ordinary letter. And for the first time since leaving my parents' house after Sophie's birthday, I couldn't shake the feeling that Grandpa's promise was finally beginning to unfold. I didn't open the envelope that night. Instead, I placed it on the kitchen counter beside my keys and made myself a cup of tea. It wasn't because I wasn't curious. I was. More than I wanted to admit. But Grandpa had spent his entire life teaching me that important decisions should never be made in the middle of strong emotions. If something can wait until morning, he used to say, it probably should. So I waited. The envelope remained exactly where I had left it. The next morning, sunlight spilled across my kitchen as I finally picked it up. The handwriting was unmistakable. Charles Whitmore, Attorney at law. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored paper. Dear Olivia, if you are reading this, I believe the time your grandfather prepared for may finally be approaching. I would appreciate the opportunity to meet with you at your earliest convenience. Please do not bring the sealed envelope your grandfather entrusted to you until after we have spoken. Our conversation should remain confidential for now. Sincerely, Charles Whitmore. That was it. No explanation. No clues. Just another reminder that Grandpa's plan had always depended on patience. I folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope. For the first time in years, I found myself wondering whether Grandpa had seen something none of us had. Mr. Whitmore's office sat inside one of the oldest buildings downtown. The lobby still had polished marble floors and brass mailboxes that looked as though they had belonged there for generations. When I arrived that afternoon, his receptionist smiled immediately. Miss Bennet. I nodded. Mr. Whitmore is expecting you. She led me into a quiet office lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Large windows overlooked the city skyline. Behind an oak desk stood a man in his early 70s with neatly combed grey hair. He smiled warmly. Olivia. It's good to see you again. You too, Mr. Whitmore. He shook my hand with both of his. Please. Sit. For a moment neither of us spoke. He simply studied me with the same thoughtful expression Grandpa often had. Finally he smiled. You've become exactly the woman your grandfather hoped you would. I looked down. I still miss him. So do I. His voice softened. He was my closest friend for almost 40 years. Mr. Whitmore opened a leather folder resting on his desk. Your grandfather left detailed instructions. I know. You've followed every one of them. I promised him I would. He nodded approvingly. He expected nothing less. I hesitated. Can I ask you something? Of course. Did Grandpa know this day would come? Mr. Whitmore leaned back in his chair. He couldn't predict the future. He smiled faintly. But he understood people remarkably well. He believed families often reveal their true priorities when discussing inheritance. My mind immediately returned to Sophie's birthday dinner. The applause. The announcement. Dad's certainty. Mr. Whitmore continued. Your grandfather wasn't trying to test anyone. He simply believed that character becomes easiest to recognize when people think they're dividing possessions. I listened quietly. He often said something I'll never forget. Mr. Whitmore smiled. Money doesn't reveal who people are. It removes the reasons they pretend to be someone else. The room grew silent. I realized Grandpa hadn't been planning revenge. He had been waiting for clarity. Before I left, Mr. Whitmore stood and walked me to the door. There is only one thing I need you to do. What is it? When the time comes. He looked directly into my eyes. Read your grandfather's sealed letter. I frowned slightly. Not yet. He shook his head. Not yet. Very soon. As I stepped outside into the afternoon sunshine, I felt the envelope inside my purse. For 3 years, it had been nothing more than a mystery. Now, it had become a countdown. And somewhere deep inside, I knew the biggest secret Grandpa had ever protected was much closer to being revealed than anyone in my family could possibly imagine. 2 weeks passed without another word from Mr. Whitmore. Life settled back into its familiar rhythm. Work. Home. The occasional phone call from Mom. Nothing unusual. Yet every morning before leaving for the office, I found myself glancing at Grandpa's sealed envelope resting inside the lockbox. I never touched it. Not because I wasn't curious. Because I had trusted Grandpa my entire life. I wasn't about to stop now. Late Friday afternoon, my phone buzzed again. This time it was Sophie. Hey, stranger. I smiled. Hi. What are you doing Sunday? I don't think I have any plans. Good. Her voice brightened. Mom wants everyone over for dinner. I hesitated. I don't know. Please. She laughed softly. If you say no, she'll spend the entire week pretending she's not disappointed. I couldn't help smiling. That sounds like Mom. So. She waited. You'll come? After a long pause, I answered. Okay. Good. And Olivia? Yeah. I'm glad. So am I. Sunday evening felt strangely familiar. The same driveway. The same flower beds lining the front porch. The same wind chimes Grandpa had hung years before. Some things never seemed to change. When I walked inside, Mom hugged me a little longer than usual. It's good to have you here. It's good to be here. Dad appeared from the living room. For a brief second, neither of us knew whether to shake hands, hug, or simply smile. He solved the problem himself. He hugged me. I'm happy you came. Me too. His voice carried none of the certainty it once had. Only quiet gratitude. Dinner was much smaller than Sophie's birthday celebration. Just the four of us. Without dozens of relatives filling every silence, conversation felt more honest. Dad asked about work. Really asked. He listened while I described a recent investment project. He even asked follow-up questions. Something he had never done before. Mom noticed too. She smiled quietly but said nothing. Sophie spent most of dinner talking about renovating the lake cabin. I've been looking at contractors. Dad nodded. It'll need a new roof within a few years. I know. I'm making a list. I listened without interrupting. None of it bothered me anymore. Grandpa's words had slowly changed something inside me. Comparison had lost its grip. Just as Mom began clearing the plates, the doorbell rang. I'll get it, Dad said. A minute later he returned looking confused. Olivia. Someone's here to see you. I frowned. Me? Standing in the doorway was Mr. Charles Whitmore. He carried a slim leather briefcase beneath one arm. The room immediately fell silent. Dad looked from him to me. You know each other? Mr. Whitmore smiled politely. We've met before. He stepped inside. I'm sorry for arriving unannounced. I tried calling earlier. I wasn't able to reach you. I looked surprised. My phone must have been on silent. He nodded. I suspected as much. Then he looked around the room. I'm actually glad everyone is here. Dad's expression became more puzzled. What is this about? Mr. Whitmore set his briefcase carefully on the dining table. It's regarding your father's estate. Every conversation stopped. Sophie looked at me. Mom slowly sat back down. Dad frowned. My father's estate was settled years ago. Mr. Whitmore met his eyes calmly. No. He spoke with quiet certainty. It wasn't. Then he turned toward me. Olivia. His voice was gentle. I believe it's finally time. He glanced toward my purse resting beside the front door. Would you please bring the sealed envelope your grandfather entrusted to you? For several long seconds, no one in the room spoke. 3 pairs of eyes turned toward me in complete disbelief. And for the first time in 3 years, I realized the secret Grandpa had trusted me to protect was finally ready to be revealed. The room remained perfectly still. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound came from the old grandfather clock in the hallway, its steady ticking suddenly louder than it had ever seemed before. Dad looked from Mr. Whitmore to me, then toward the purse resting beside the front door. Olivia, he said quietly. What envelope? I took a slow breath. For 3 years, I had imagined this moment. Not because I had been waiting to surprise anyone. Because I had promised Grandpa I would never let it happen before the right time. I'll be right back. I walked to the front hall, picked up my purse, and carefully removed the small leather pouch. Inside rested the cream-colored envelope, exactly where Grandpa had placed it into my hands. The seal remained untouched. I carried it back to the dining table. Mom immediately recognized Grandpa's handwriting. Oh, she covered her mouth. I remember that envelope. You do? Sophie asked. Mom nodded slowly. He gave it to Olivia the day before he passed away. Dad looked stunned. You never told me. Grandpa's attorney answered before I could. Because she promised she wouldn't. He turned toward me. Would you please read the instruction written on the front? I looked down. The familiar words were still there. My voice remained calm, open only after the family chooses its future. Silence followed. Dad slowly lowered his eyes. He already understood. The dinner on Sophie's birthday. The announcement. The inheritance. That had been the moment Grandpa had predicted. Mr. Whitmore nodded gently. Please. It's time. My hands trembled slightly as I carefully broke the seal for the first time. Inside was a folded handwritten letter. Several pages. Every line written in Grandpa's unmistakable handwriting. I swallowed before beginning. My dearest Olivia, if you're reading this, then my family has finally reached the decision I expected them to make. I stopped. No one around the table moved. I continued. Before anyone misunderstands why I created this plan, let me say something clearly. This is not punishment. This is not revenge. Love should never be used that way. I looked toward Mr. Whitmore. He simply nodded for me to continue. People often believe inheritance is about dividing money. They are mistaken. Inheritance is really about revealing responsibility. Dad quietly closed his eyes. I continued reading. Over the last 20 years, I have watched both of my granddaughters grow into remarkable women. Sophie has a generous heart. She brings joy wherever she goes. Sophie immediately began crying. Olivia. I struggled to keep my own voice steady. You became something even rarer. Someone others can trust when life becomes difficult. The room remained silent. I watched you visit me every Saturday without fail. Not because you expected anything in return. Because you believed family deserved your time. Mom quietly wiped away tears. I watched you help your grandmother through chemotherapy. Balance my accounts after my eyesight failed. Repair the old cabin roof with your own savings. You never once asked whether anyone noticed. My vision blurred. I hadn't realized Grandpa had remembered all those small moments. Character, he wrote, is revealed by what people continue doing after everyone stops applauding. No one spoke. No one could. Then I reached the paragraph that made my heart stop. The greatest thing I leave behind is not the house. Not the cabin. Not the family business. Those are only possessions. I slowly turned the page. The final sentence waited there. The real legacy. I looked up instinctively. Every eye in the room was fixed on me. Then I quietly finished reading. Is something I've already entrusted to you. No one spoke after I finished the last sentence. The room had become so quiet that I could hear the soft ticking of the kitchen clock behind me. Dad stared at the letter in my hands. Mom sat perfectly still, one hand covering her mouth. Sophie looked back and forth between me and Mr. Whitmore, completely confused. Finally, Dad broke the silence. What does that mean? Mr. Whitmore calmly unlocked the leather briefcase he had placed on the dining table. It means your father planned this long before he became ill. He removed several neatly organized folders. May I? I nodded. He placed the first document on the table. This is the Carter Family Trust. Dad frowned. I've never heard of it. I'm aware. Mr. Whitmore adjusted his glasses. Your father intentionally kept it confidential. He looked toward me. Only 2 people knew it existed. Your father. And Olivia. Dad's eyes widened. For 3 years. I quietly nodded. Yes. He leaned back in his chair, clearly struggling to process everything. You knew all this time? I knew there was a trust. I answered honestly. I didn't know everything inside it. Mr. Whitmore smiled approvingly. That is correct. He opened another folder. Your grandfather separated his estate into 2 completely different parts. The first. He glanced around the room. Included the family home, the lake cabin, and the business. Dad nodded slowly. The things we've always considered the inheritance. Exactly. Mr. Whitmore folded his hands. But your father believed those assets would eventually lose value. The room grew quiet again. He often reminded me. Mr. Whitmore smiled faintly. That buildings grow old. Businesses rise and fall. Markets change. He gently tapped the second folder. So he created something entirely different. I felt my heartbeat quicken. What is it? Mr. Whitmore looked directly at me. 22 years ago, your grandfather quietly began investing. Dad frowned. Investing in what? Everything. He smiled. Broad market funds. Commercial property. Municipal bonds. Technology. Healthcare. He invested patiently. Carefully. For more than 2 decades. The room remained silent. He never spoke about it because he didn't want anyone treating him differently. Mr. Whitmore slowly slid a financial statement across the table. The trust now owns substantial investments across several states. Mom looked overwhelmed. I had no idea. No one did. Mr. Whitmore nodded. That was intentional. Dad stared at the paperwork. So? His voice barely worked. Who owns it? The attorney looked toward me. The Carter Legacy Trust has one acting trustee. My stomach tightened. Olivia. The word seemed to echo through the room. Sophie blinked several times. You. I slowly looked at Mr. Whitmore. I don't own it. No. He smiled. You manage it. I frowned slightly. There's a difference. A very important one. He nodded. Your grandfather never wanted enormous wealth placed into someone's hands. He wanted responsibility placed into trustworthy hands. Dad lowered his head. He chose Olivia. Mr. Whitmore answered gently. He chose the person who had already spent years proving she could be trusted without expecting recognition. Another silence settled over the room. Not an uncomfortable one. A thoughtful one. For the first time that evening, nobody was thinking about the house. Or the cabin. Or the family business. Those things suddenly seemed very small. Because Grandpa's greatest legacy had never been about leaving someone more money. It had always been about leaving the future in the hands of the person he believed would protect it with wisdom, patience, and compassion. And without ever asking for it. That person had quietly become me. No one reached for the documents. They remained spread across the dining table like pieces of a story none of us had known we were living. Dad was the first to speak. So, this trust belongs to Olivia? Mr. Whitmore gently shook his head. No. He looked directly at me. That's exactly what your grandfather hoped no one would assume. Everyone waited. The Carter Legacy Trust was never created to make one person wealthy. He opened another folder. It was created to protect this family's future. I frowned. What does that mean? He smiled. It means you are the trustee. You manage it. You protect it. You decide how it grows. But the trust itself has rules your grandfather personally wrote. He slid a thick document toward me. Those rules cannot be changed. I carefully opened the first page. The title read, The Carter Legacy Trust Charter. Beneath it was Grandpa's signature. I swallowed. Hard. When did he write this? Nearly 12 years ago. Dad looked stunned. 12. Mr. Whitmore nodded. He began planning long before his health declined. Sophie leaned forward. So, if Olivia doesn't own the money? She hesitated. Who does? The trust. He answered calmly. And eventually. He smiled. Future generations of the Carter family. The room became quiet again. Mr. Whitmore continued. Your grandfather believed inheritance should never reward popularity. It should reward responsibility. He looked around the table. So he created several conditions. I slowly turned another page. Every paragraph had been typed. Every instruction was remarkably specific. The trust could never be divided for personal luxury. The principal could never be withdrawn simply because someone wanted a larger house or a more expensive lifestyle. Instead, the income generated by the investments could only be used for very specific purposes. Education, medical emergencies, family businesses facing genuine hardship, scholarships, charitable work, opportunities that created long-term stability, not temporary comfort. I looked up. He thought of everything. Mr. Whitmore smiled. He usually did. Dad slowly rubbed his forehead. I don't understand. If he wanted all of us to benefit. He looked toward me. Why not simply tell us? Mr. Whitmore answered quietly. Because people behave differently when they think someone is watching. He folded his hands. Your father wanted to know who each family member became when there was nothing obvious to gain. His words settled heavily over the room. He watched. He listened. He waited. Then he smiled gently. And every year, he became more certain. Dad looked toward me. I never knew. No. Mr. Whitmore replied. You were never supposed to. Mom suddenly spoke for the first time in several minutes. Did Olivia ever? Her voice trembled slightly. Ask for any of this? Mr. Whitmore smiled. Never. Not once. In fact. He looked at me with obvious admiration. 3 different times she asked whether your father had made the right decision. I looked down, slightly embarrassed. I did. Mr. Whitmore nodded. She told me someone else might be better qualified. Sophie stared at me. You said that. I shrugged quietly. I didn't want Grandpa making a decision because he felt sorry for me. Mr. Whitmore laughed softly. And that, he pointed toward me, was precisely why he never doubted his choice. Dad slowly stood from his chair and walked toward the dining room window. Outside, the last light of evening had almost disappeared. I spent years believing confidence was the most important quality a person could have. He looked back at me. Your grandfather believed humility mattered more. No one corrected him. Because for the first time, he was finally seeing what Grandpa had seen all along. Not the daughter who demanded attention. Not the daughter who received the loudest applause. But the daughter who quietly carried responsibility without expecting anyone to notice. And in that moment, I realized Grandpa's greatest gift had never been the trust itself. It was the faith he had placed in me long before I had learned to place that same faith in myself. No one spoke for several minutes. The documents remained spread across the dining table, but they no longer felt like legal papers. They felt like Grandpa's final conversation with all of us. Mr. Whitmore quietly gathered one folder and handed it to me. There's one last document. I looked at the title. Letter to the trustee. This one is only for you. Dad immediately shook his head. Read it. I looked at Mr. Whitmore. He wanted you to. The attorney smiled. He also told me your father would probably say exactly that. A faint laugh broke the tension around the room. For the first time all evening, the atmosphere felt lighter. I unfolded the letter. Olivia. If you've reached this page, then you've learned about the trust. The legal papers explain how it works. This letter explains why it exists. I paused before continuing. Money has never impressed me. I've met wealthy people who left nothing behind except arguments. I've met ordinary people who changed generations because they taught kindness. Never confuse wealth with legacy. The room became perfectly still again. I didn't choose you because you were overlooked. I chose you because you never allowed being overlooked to change your character. That matters more than intelligence. More than success. More than money. A lump formed in my throat. One day your family will probably expect you to decide who deserves what. Don't. Instead, ask who is willing to protect what comes next. I slowly turned the page. If someone needs help because life has been unfair, help them. If someone wants money because they refuse responsibility, teach them. Never let guilt make your decisions. Never let anger make them either. Dad quietly lowered his head. Mom reached for his hand. Neither of them interrupted. The trust exists for one purpose. To give every future Carter child opportunities that cannot be taken away. Education. Health. Security. Hope. Those are the only inheritances worth protecting. The final paragraph was shorter. I'm proud of you. Not because of what you've accomplished. Because of who you've chosen to become when nobody was watching. Love always. Grandpa. I carefully folded the letter. No one spoke. No one needed to. The words seemed to linger in the room long after I finished reading them. Finally, Dad stood. Slowly. Quietly. He walked around the table until he stopped beside my chair. For a moment, he simply looked at me. Then he spoke. I spent years believing I understood my father. A sad smile crossed his face. I didn't. He looked down at Grandpa's letter. I thought he admired the loudest person in the room. He shook his head. He was watching the quiet one. A tear rolled down Mom's cheek. Sophie reached across the table and gently took my hand. I'm happy he chose you. There wasn't even a hint of jealousy in her voice. Only relief. I don't think I could carry something like this. I smiled softly. You won't have to carry it alone. She squeezed my hand. I know. Mr. Whitmore closed his briefcase. I believe my work here is finally finished. Before leaving, he turned back one last time. Your grandfather once told me something I've never forgotten. We all looked at him. He said, the strongest families aren't the ones that divide everything equally. They're the ones where someone is wise enough to keep everyone together. The front door closed quietly behind him. None of us moved. Because for the first time in many years, we weren't thinking about what we might inherit. We were thinking about the family Grandpa had spent a lifetime trying to protect. I barely slept that night. Not because I was overwhelmed by the size of the trust. Because I couldn't stop thinking about Grandpa's final words. Never let guilt make your decisions. Never let anger make them either. By sunrise. Those sentences had become louder than everything else. The legal documents remained neatly stacked on my dining table exactly where I had left them. I hadn't opened them again. There would be time for numbers. 4 contracts. 4 meetings. This morning, I wanted to remember the man behind them. Saturday mornings had always belonged to Grandpa. When I was little, he'd pick me up before 8 and we'd drive to the farmer's market on the other side of town. We almost never bought much. Fresh bread. A bag of peaches. Sometimes flowers for Grandma. The trip had never been about shopping. It had been about conversation. He believed people revealed who they really were in ordinary moments. Not during holidays. Not during celebrations. Just while carrying groceries to the car. One morning, when I was about 12, I noticed him quietly paying for a stranger's vegetables after the elderly man realized he'd forgotten his wallet. The man tried to refuse. Grandpa simply smiled. You can repay me. How? When someone else needs help. As we walked back to the truck, I asked why he never told anyone about things like that. He laughed. If people know you're being generous, they'll compliment you. If nobody knows, you'll discover whether kindness was ever the real goal. At the time, I hadn't fully understood. Now I did. Around 10 that morning, my phone rang. It was Mr. Whitmore. Good morning, Olivia. Good morning. I hope I didn't wake you. You didn't. I'd like you to stop by my office Monday afternoon. For paperwork. For your first trustee meeting. The words sounded heavier than I expected. My first. He chuckled softly. There will probably be many. I suppose so. He became serious again. I want you to remember something before we meet. I'm listening. You don't work for the trust. You serve it. I frowned slightly. There's a difference. A very important one. He paused. You're not there to make people happy. You're there to honor your grandfather's purpose. After we ended the call, I stood quietly beside the kitchen window. Outside, children rode bicycles through the apartment courtyard while neighbors walked their dogs beneath a clear blue sky. The world looked exactly the same as it had yesterday. Yet everything inside me felt different. Not richer. Not more important. Simply more responsible. That afternoon, I found myself driving to the cemetery again. Grandpa's headstone sat beneath the same old oak tree, its leaves gently moving in the summer breeze. I sat on the grass beside him just as I had countless times before. Well, I smiled quietly. You always did enjoy surprises. The breeze answered with silence. I finally understand. I looked down at the small American flag someone had placed beside the stone. You weren't protecting money. You were protecting us. A memory suddenly returned. Years ago, after helping him repair the roof on the lake cabin, I'd asked why he insisted on fixing old things instead of replacing them. He had smiled. Because replacing something is easy. Taking care of it. He had handed me another hammer. Is what builds character. At the time, I thought he was talking about cabins. Now I realized. He had been talking about family. As I stood to leave, I placed one hand gently against the cool granite. I'll take care of it. Not the trust. Not the investments. The family. Because somewhere along the way, Grandpa had quietly shown me that the greatest inheritance wasn't something you received. It was a promise you chose to keep. Monday afternoon arrived sooner than I expected. I left work an hour early and drove downtown, my thoughts drifting between quarterly reports and Grandpa's handwritten letter. Every traffic light seemed to give me another reason to wonder what I was stepping into. Mr. Whitmore had said this would be my first trustee meeting. The words still sounded unfamiliar. I parked outside the same historic building where we'd met only 2 weeks earlier. The polished brass nameplate beside the entrance caught the afternoon sun, and for a moment I simply stood there, taking a slow breath. Nothing about my life had changed on the surface. I still lived in the same apartment. I still drove the same car. I still planned to be at work by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Yet somehow, everything felt different. The receptionist smiled as soon as I walked inside. Good afternoon, Miss Bennett. Good afternoon. Mr. Whitmore is waiting for you. I followed her down the familiar hallway until she opened the office door. This time, however, someone else was already seated inside. A woman in her early 60s stood as I entered. She wore a navy blue suit and smiled warmly. Olivia. I'm Rachel Morrison. We shook hands. It's nice to meet you. Mr. Whitmore closed the file he had been reading. Rachel has worked with your grandfather's trust since the day it was established. I looked surprised. I thought only the two of you knew about it. We did. Rachel smiled. I handled the accounting. Charles handled the legal side. Your grandfather handled everything else. We all laughed softly. It sounded exactly like him. After everyone sat down, Mr. Whitmore placed a thick binder in front of me. This belongs to you now. The cover read, Carter Legacy Trust. I carefully opened the first page. Inside wasn't a list of investments. It was a letter. Another one. This one had been typed. To every future trustee. I looked up. There were trustees before me. Mr. Whitmore nodded. Only one. Your grandfather. I smiled. So this is his replacement handbook. In a way. Rachel leaned forward. He wanted the trust to survive long after all of us were gone. He believed systems mattered more than personalities. That sounded exactly like Grandpa. For the next hour, they patiently explained how everything worked. The trust owned commercial buildings, investment funds, farmland, and several long-term business partnerships. Every decision required careful review. Every investment had one purpose. Long-term stability. Not quick profits. Grandpa hadn't built wealth by taking enormous risks. He had built it through consistency. The same way he'd lived his life. Patiently. Quietly. Responsibly. Finally, Rachel slid another folder toward me. There's one more thing. What is it? This year's requests. I frowned. Requests? She nodded. Every year, family members may apply for assistance. I slowly opened the folder. Inside were applications. College tuition. Medical expenses. Emergency home repairs. Business loans. Each request included financial records, supporting documents, and personal letters. I looked up. So I decide. Mr. Whitmore gently shook his head. No. You evaluate. Then the trustee committee votes. There are rules. There is accountability. And there is transparency. Relief washed over me. I'm glad. So was your grandfather. As the meeting ended, Mr. Whitmore walked me to the elevator. Before the doors opened, he said something that caught me completely off guard. Olivia. Yes. Do you know why your grandfather never made you the beneficiary? I thought for a moment. He didn't want me to confuse ownership with responsibility. Mr. Whitmore smiled proudly. Exactly. Then he added one final thought. A person who owns something asks, "What can this do for me?" He paused. But a person who protects something asks, "What will happen after I'm gone?" The elevator doors opened. As I stepped inside, I realized Grandpa had never been preparing me to inherit wealth. He had been preparing me to become a guardian of something much more important. A future that didn't belong to me alone. 3 days after my meeting with Mr. Whitmore, the trust became something more than a binder sitting on my bookshelf. It became real. I had just finished reviewing client reports at work when my phone vibrated. It was Rachel. "Hi, Olivia." "Hi. I wanted to let you know we've received a new assistance request." "So soon?" She laughed softly. "Life doesn't wait for convenient timing." "I suppose it doesn't. There isn't an emergency, but I think you should review it before next week's trustee meeting. I'll stop by after work." "We'll be here." That afternoon, Rachel greeted me with a thin blue folder. "This is all of it." I thanked her and sat down in the conference room. The application wasn't from someone I knew well. It belonged to my cousin, Ethan. We had grown up attending the same family gatherings, though adulthood had taken us in different directions. The first page explained everything. 6 months earlier, Ethan had been diagnosed with a rare neurological condition. His health insurance covered most of the treatment, but not the specialized rehabilitation his doctors believed would help him recover. Without it, he would probably lose much of the movement in his right hand. I continued reading. The medical reports were detailed. Every recommendation matched. The request wasn't for luxury. It wasn't for convenience. It was for hope. Rachel quietly entered the room carrying 2 cups of coffee. "What do you think?" I looked up. "I think Grandpa would have approved this." She smiled. "So do I." Still, I read every page twice. Grandpa had always believed compassion and responsibility belonged together. Helping someone didn't mean ignoring the facts. It meant understanding them. By the time I finished, I had highlighted medical recommendations, financial statements, and physician reports. Everything supported the request. Nothing felt exaggerated. Nothing felt hidden. When the trustee committee met the following Tuesday, the discussion lasted less than 15 minutes. One physician reviewed the medical documents. An accountant confirmed the financial information. Rachel summarized the trust guidelines. Finally, everyone looked toward me. "Any concerns?" I shook my head. "No. This request matches exactly why Grandpa created the trust." The committee voted unanimously. Approved. It was the first decision I had ever made as trustee. And somehow, it didn't feel like giving money away. It felt like continuing something Grandpa had started years before. A week later, I received a handwritten thank you note from Ethan. There was no mention of dollar amounts. No dramatic promises. Only a few simple sentences. "Olivia, I don't know who supported my application, but someone gave me another chance to keep using my hands. As a carpenter, that means more than I can explain. One day, I hope I can help someone else the way I've been helped. Thank you." There was no way for him to know I had been involved. The trust protected everyone's privacy, just as Grandpa intended. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the back of the trustee binder. Not because it was required. Because I wanted a reminder. Grandpa had been right. Helping people quietly changed something inside you. Recognition wasn't necessary. Gratitude wasn't expected. Knowing someone had another chance was enough. As I closed the binder, I realized my grandfather hadn't left me a fortune to enjoy. He had left me a purpose to protect. And for the first time since opening his letter, I truly understood why he had trusted me to carry it forward. Nearly a month passed before anything connected the trust to my own family again. Life returned to its familiar rhythm. Weekdays belonged to the office. Evenings were spent reading reports or taking long walks through my neighborhood. On Sunday afternoons, Mom called more often than she used to. Our conversations were simple. She asked whether I was eating well. I reminded her not to spend all day working in the garden. Neither of us mentioned the trust. It was as though we both understood some things needed time. Then, one Tuesday evening, my phone rang. It was Sophie. "Hey," I answered. "Hi." Her voice sounded unusually quiet. "Are you free?" "I am now. Can I come by?" I glanced at the clock. "Of course. I'll be there in 20 minutes. When Sophie arrived, she wasn't carrying her usual bright smile. Instead, she held a thick folder against her chest. I made tea while she sat at the kitchen table, looking around my apartment. "I've always liked it here." I smiled. "It's not very fancy." "I know." She looked around again. "But it feels peaceful." I placed 2 mugs on the table and sat across from her. "So, what's going on?" She took a slow breath. "I need advice." That surprised me. Growing up, Sophie rarely asked anyone for advice. She usually trusted her instincts. She slid the folder across the table. "I've been reviewing the numbers for the lake cabin." I opened it. Contractor estimates. Roof inspections. Foundation reports. Electrical repairs. The costs were much higher than I expected. I had no idea it needed this much work. She nodded. Neither did I. For a moment. Neither of us spoke. Then she quietly admitted something I never expected to hear. "I don't think I can afford to keep it." I looked up. "You don't have to decide tonight." "I know." She smiled sadly. "I've spent the last few weeks thinking about Dad's announcement." I waited. The more I thought about it, she shook her head. The less it felt like a gift. "What do you mean?" She looked toward the window. "I thought Grandpa loved that cabin because it was valuable." She laughed softly. "I finally realized he loved it because we were all there together." Her words reminded me of something Grandpa used to say. "A house is only wood. People make it a home." Sophie looked back at me. "I think Mom and Dad believed they were giving me security." They were. But security isn't the same thing as responsibility. She nodded. "Exactly." For the first time, I realized something important. Sophie had never asked to become the favorite. She had simply grown up inside a role she hadn't created. "I don't want the family falling apart because of property." She said it so quietly I almost missed it. "I'd rather lose the cabin than lose my sister." A lump formed in my throat. "You won't lose me." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I know. I just wish I'd said that years ago." We sat together in comfortable silence for several minutes. As she prepared to leave, she stopped at the front door. "Olivia?" "Yeah. I used to think Grandpa trusted you because you were smarter than the rest of us." I smiled. "He probably would have disagreed." She laughed. "I think I know why now." "Why?" She looked at me with genuine admiration. "Because whenever people bring you a problem, you never start by asking who deserves help. You start by asking what they need." After she left, I stood quietly in the hallway. For the first time since Grandpa's secret had been revealed, I felt something changing inside our family. Not because of the trust. Not because of money. Because, little by little, we were finally beginning to understand the lesson Grandpa had been trying to teach us all along. Autumn arrived almost without warning. The maple trees outside my office turned shades of gold and crimson, and cool mornings slowly replaced the summer heat. Life continued much the way it always had. I buried myself in work during the week. Trust meetings filled one afternoon each month. Family dinners became more frequent, though they were smaller and far quieter than they used to be. Something had changed after Grandpa's letter. Nobody spoke over one another anymore. Nobody tried to prove who mattered most. It wasn't perfect. But it was different. Sometimes different was enough. One Thursday evening, I was finishing dinner when my phone rang. "Dad." I smiled before answering. "Hi, Dad." There was a long pause. "Hi, sweetheart." His voice immediately caught my attention. He sounded tired. More tired than he had since leaving the hospital. Everything okay? He hesitated. I was wondering if we could talk. Of course. Not on the phone. I set my fork down. Do you want me to come over? If you're free. I'll leave now. 25 minutes later, I pulled into my parents' driveway. The porch light was already on. Dad opened the front door before I had a chance to knock. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Thanks for coming. You sounded worried. I am. He led me into the living room. Mom was sitting quietly on the sofa with a folder resting on her lap. She looked up and managed a small smile. It's good to see you. You too. Dad poured 3 cups of coffee before finally sitting down. For nearly a minute, nobody spoke. Finally, he slid the folder toward me. I need your opinion. I opened it. The first page carried the company logo of our family's manufacturing business. The business Grandpa had started nearly 40 years earlier. The business Dad had proudly announced would someday belong to Sophie. I turned another page. Then another. Sales reports. Cash flow statements. Debt summaries. My professional instincts took over almost immediately. Something wasn't right. I looked up. How long has this been happening? Dad sighed heavily. About 18 months. 18? He nodded. We lost 2 major clients. Raw material costs increased. And he stopped. And what? We made some decisions that didn't work. I continued reviewing the reports. Profit margins had been shrinking steadily. Equipment loans were coming due. Several contracts had already been cancelled. The business wasn't collapsing, but it was heading in that direction. Does Sophie know? Mom answered quietly. Not everything. I closed the folder. You should tell her. We will. Dad looked down at his hands. He struggled to finish the sentence. I didn't want the first thing she inherited to be a problem. The words hung heavily in the room. For years, Dad had believed he was giving Sophie security. Now he realized he might have been giving her a burden instead. He leaned back slowly. I've spent the last month asking myself the same question. I waited. What if your father knew? I frowned. Grandpa. Dad nodded. What if he saw this coming years before I ever did? The thought settled quietly between us. Grandpa had built businesses, managed investments, survived recessions. He understood financial cycles better than anyone in our family. Maybe, just maybe, the trust hadn't been created only to preserve wealth. Maybe it had been created because Grandpa already knew the family business would someday face a challenge no single person could solve alone. Dad looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not pride. Not regret. Trust. I don't need you to fix this. He spoke carefully. I just need someone honest enough to tell me the truth. I looked down at the reports one more time, then back at him. The truth. He nodded. I took a slow breath. The business can absolutely survive. Both of them looked relieved. But not if. Everyone keeps pretending nothing's wrong. For the first time in years, Dad didn't defend himself. He simply nodded. I was afraid you'd say that. And I think Grandpa knew you eventually would need to hear it. The following Sunday, Dad invited Sophie over for lunch. Not because it was a family tradition. Because he could no longer carry the weight of the truth alone. I arrived a few minutes early to help Mom in the kitchen. She was unusually quiet as she chopped vegetables for a salad. You didn't sleep much, did you? I asked. She offered a tired smile. Was it that obvious? You've made coffee twice. She looked down at the counter. I keep thinking about your grandfather. So do I. She sighed softly. I finally understand why he never argued with your father. I looked at her. He simply kept preparing for the future. Those words stayed with me as the doorbell rang. Sophie walked in carrying a homemade apple pie. I come bearing dessert. Dad smiled. Perfect timing. She hugged Mom, then me. I hope nobody's on a diet. We gave that up years ago, Dad joked. For a little while, lunch felt surprisingly normal. We talked about work. Mom's garden. A neighbor's new puppy. The first snowfall predicted for the following month. It almost felt like the family dinners we should have been having all along. Then Dad slowly placed his fork on the table. "Sophie." His voice immediately changed the mood. She looked up. "Yeah. There's something I should have told you weeks ago." She glanced around the table. "What is it?" Dad reached for the folder beside his chair. The same folder he had shown me a few nights earlier. "I've been dishonest." Her expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "What do you mean?" "I let you believe the family business was stronger than it is." He opened the folder. "It isn't." She frowned. "I don't understand." He quietly slid several financial statements across the table. "Take a look." The smile slowly disappeared from her face as she turned each page. Her eyes moved carefully over the numbers. Revenue, expenses, debt, projected losses. She looked up again. "Is this real?" Dad nodded. "Every page." Silence settled over the dining room. Finally, Sophie whispered, "How bad is it?" Dad didn't sugarcoat the answer. "If we continue exactly as we are." He took a slow breath. "The business probably won't survive another 3 years." Mom closed her eyes. The words were painful to hear aloud. Sophie sat back quietly. She wasn't angry. She wasn't defensive. She simply looked heartbroken. "I thought." Her voice cracked. "I thought you were giving me security." Dad looked down. "So did I. I wanted you to have something stable." He shook his head slowly. "I didn't realize stability had already started disappearing." Nobody interrupted him. "I should have told you the truth before making promises. You deserved that." Sophie looked toward me. "You knew." I answered honestly. "I found out this week. And I believe it can be saved." She leaned forward. "You do." "I do. But not by pretending the problem doesn't exist." She quietly nodded. For the next hour, we talked honestly. Not as parents and daughters. Not as the favorite child and the overlooked one. Just as 4 adults trying to solve a difficult problem together. Dad admitted mistakes he'd made during the past 2 years. Ignoring market changes. Delaying equipment upgrades. Trusting that loyal customers would never leave. Sophie admitted something too. "I've never actually wanted to run the business." The room became completely still. Dad blinked. "You haven't." She shook her head. "I love the family history. I love what Grandpa built. But I've never had your passion for manufacturing." She smiled sadly. "I kept pretending because I thought that's what everyone expected." Those words hit Dad harder than any financial report. For years, he had believed he was protecting Sophie's future. Instead, he had quietly been placing someone else's dream on her shoulders. He covered his face with one hand. "I've been making decisions for people instead of listening to them." I reached across the table and gently placed my hand over his. "We all get things wrong." He looked at me. "The important part," I smiled warmly, "is what we choose to do after we finally see the truth." For the first time since Grandpa's letter had been opened, it felt as though our family wasn't just uncovering old secrets. We were finally learning how to have the conversations we should have had years ago. After lunch, nobody rushed to leave the table. The dishes sat untouched. The coffee had grown cold. For the first time in years, our family wasn't pretending everything was fine. And strangely enough, that felt like progress. Dad leaned back in his chair and looked around the room. "I've been asking myself the same question all week." He folded his hands together. "What would your grandfather have done?" No one answered immediately. Not because we didn't have opinions. Because Grandpa had taught us something more important than giving quick answers. He had taught us to think first. Finally, Mom smiled softly. "He would have listened." Dad nodded. "You're right. He always listened before making decisions." He looked toward me. "What do you think?" For a moment, I wasn't his overlooked daughter. I wasn't the trustee. I was simply someone whose opinion mattered. I opened the financial reports once more. "I think the business has one major advantage. Dad looked surprised. Only one? I laughed. No. But it's the most important one. What is it? The company still has a good reputation. He frowned slightly. It does. I nodded. Customers didn't leave because they stopped trusting the business. They left because competitors adapted faster. I pointed toward one of the reports. You've been spending money maintaining old systems instead of improving them. Dad sighed. I know. I just didn't realize how far behind we'd fallen. Sophie leaned closer. So, this isn't hopeless. Not even close. She looked relieved. What would you do? I hesitated. I'd start by accepting reality. Everyone smiled. It wasn't the dramatic answer they expected, but it was the truthful one. I turned another page. The company needs modern equipment. It needs better online sales. It needs updated production software. And it needs leadership that's willing to change. Dad listened carefully. Not once did he interrupt. For years, he'd always believed he had to provide the answers. Today, he was finally asking questions. I can handle the financial planning. I continued. But I can't run the business. Dad nodded. I understand. Sophie looked thoughtful. I don't think I should either. No one argued. Instead, Dad surprised all of us. I agree. She blinked. You do? He smiled sadly. I spent too many years deciding what your future should look like. I'm not making that mistake again. A tear quietly rolled down Sophie's cheek. Thank you. Mom reached across the table and gently touched Dad's hand. What if? She paused. We ask for help. Dad looked confused. From who? She smiled. There are people who know this industry better than we do. Consultants. Managers. Advisors. You've spent years trying to carry everything yourself. You don't have to anymore. Dad laughed quietly. I married a smarter woman than I deserve. Mom smiled. I've been trying to tell you that for 35 years. Everyone laughed. The tension that had filled the room earlier slowly began to disappear. Not because the problems had been solved. Because they finally belonged to all of us instead of just one person. Before I gathered the reports, Dad looked directly at me. I need to ask you something. Okay. This isn't about the trust. I nodded. It's about us. He took a slow breath. Would you help me rebuild the business? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I thought about Grandpa. About every Saturday morning. About every lesson that had quietly shaped my life. Finally, I smiled. I'll help. Relief immediately spread across Dad's face. But, I continued. I'm helping because we're family. Not because Grandpa trusted me. Dad nodded before I even finished. I understand. No. He smiled warmly. I finally do. As I closed the folder, I realized something beautiful. For the first time in our family's history, we weren't deciding who deserved the future. We were deciding how to build one together. Over the next 3 weeks, our family settled into a routine none of us could have imagined a month earlier. Every Wednesday evening, we gathered around the conference table inside the old office above the factory floor. The room hadn't changed in years. Grandpa's framed photograph still hung on the wall. His old wooden desk remained in the corner, exactly where he'd left it. Even the faint smell of sawdust drifting up from the production floor felt familiar. Only one thing was different. This time, everyone had a voice. Dad opened the meeting by reviewing the latest financial reports. I've spoken with every department manager. He looked around the table. They've been more honest than I expected. Sophie smiled. Probably because you finally asked. Dad laughed. I deserved that. He handed each of us a printed report. Sales have stabilized. Not improved. But they've stopped falling. It isn't much. It's a start. I nodded. It matters. Every recovery begins with stopping the damage. Not creating miracles overnight. A few minutes later, a consultant named David Harper joined us by video call. He had spent 30 years helping family-owned manufacturing companies modernize without losing what made them successful. After reviewing our reports, he looked directly at Dad. "I'd like to ask one question." "Go ahead." "If you were starting this company today," he paused, "would you build it exactly the way it operates now?" Dad answered almost immediately, "No." "Why not?" "Because the market has changed." David smiled. "Exactly." He leaned closer to the camera. "Most family businesses don't fail because they're poorly built. They fail because they become afraid to evolve." The room grew quiet. Those words hit all of us, especially Dad. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. By the end, we had a realistic recovery plan. Upgrade outdated equipment. Expand online sales. Reduce unnecessary operating costs. Hire an experienced operations manager instead of expecting family members to fill every leadership role. Everything felt practical, achievable, hopeful. As everyone packed their papers, Dad remained seated. "I've made another decision." We looked back toward him. "It's an important one." He took a slow breath. "I've spent months thinking about who should inherit this business." He smiled faintly. "I finally realized I've been asking the wrong question." No one interrupted. "The business shouldn't belong to whoever I choose." He looked around the room. "It should belong to whoever is genuinely willing and prepared to lead it." Sophie immediately shook her head. "That isn't me." Dad nodded. "I know." Then he looked toward me. I met his eyes. Before he could speak, I smiled. "It isn't me either." He blinked. "It isn't." I shook my head. "I love helping. I love planning. But my career is somewhere else. I don't want to run the factory." Silence settled over the room. Then, unexpectedly, Dad smiled. For the first time. He wasn't disappointed. "I think your grandfather already knew that." "I think he did too." Mom laughed softly. "So after all these years?" She looked at all three of us. None of us actually wanted what we'd been arguing about. Everyone laughed. It wasn't bitter. It wasn't forced. It was honest. Dad stood and walked toward Grandpa's photograph hanging on the wall. He smiled at it for several long seconds. "You won again, Dad." We all looked toward the photograph. Grandpa had somehow managed to solve a problem years before it ever appeared. Not by choosing a favorite. Not by dividing possessions. But by teaching us to stop asking who should own everything. And start asking what would protect the family long after all of us were gone. As we locked the office and stepped outside into the cool evening air, I realized this wasn't the end of Grandpa's legacy. In many ways, it was only just beginning. The following month brought more change than the previous 5 years combined. For the first time since Grandpa had started the company, important decisions weren't being made by one person alone. Every Thursday evening, our family gathered in the conference room with David Harper and the department managers. At first, the employees seemed nervous. For years, they had grown accustomed to waiting for Dad to make every major decision. Now he began every meeting the same way. "What are we missing?" It was a simple question. But it changed everything. People started speaking more openly. Production supervisors pointed out equipment that had needed replacing for years. The sales team explained why younger customers were choosing competitors. Warehouse employees suggested small changes that reduced shipping delays almost immediately. None of the ideas were revolutionary. They simply hadn't been heard before. Dad listened carefully to every suggestion. Sometimes he asked questions. Sometimes he admitted he didn't know the answer. Watching him do that felt almost unbelievable. The man who had once believed leadership meant having all the answers had finally discovered that real leadership often began by asking better questions. One Thursday afternoon, David asked everyone to remain after the meeting. "I've reviewed 6 months of financial projections." He smiled. "I have good news." The room became quiet. "If you continue exactly as planned." He tapped the report in front of him. "The company should return to profitability within 18 months. A collective sigh of relief filled the room. Dad leaned back slowly. 18 months. I honestly wasn't sure we'd survive another year." David nodded. You probably wouldn't have. Then he smiled. But you stopped trying to protect old habits. You started protecting the future instead. Those words immediately reminded me of Grandpa. He would have liked David. After everyone left, Dad remained standing beside the conference table. I've made one more decision. Mom smiled. Another one? He laughed softly. I promise this one's easier. He looked toward Sophie. The lake cabin. She nodded. I've been thinking about it too. I don't want to sell it. Neither did I. Grandpa had built that cabin with his own hands. Nearly every childhood memory I treasured seemed to begin there. But, Dad continued, I also don't think one person should own it. He looked around the room. What if? He smiled. It belongs to all of us. Sophie immediately smiled. I'd love that. Mom nodded. So would I. Then everyone looked toward me. I smiled. I think Grandpa would have called that common sense. Dad laughed. He probably would have. A month later, the legal paperwork was completed. The cabin officially became jointly owned by the entire family through a simple family agreement. No one could sell it alone. No one could borrow against it. No one could make major decisions without everyone agreeing first. It wasn't the easiest solution. It was simply the fairest one. The first weekend after signing the papers, we all drove to the cabin together. The roof still needed repairs. The porch needed painting. The old dock leaned slightly toward the lake. But none of that mattered. For the first time in years, we weren't arguing about who would someday own the place. We were laughing about who would clean the gutters. As I watched Dad hand Sophie a paintbrush before picking up one himself, I quietly smiled. Grandpa had spent years teaching us that families weren't held together by property. They were held together by shared responsibility. Standing beside the lake that afternoon, I finally realized we were no longer protecting Grandpa's legacy because we had to. We were protecting it because, at last, it had become our own. By the time December arrived, something had quietly changed inside our family. Not all at once. Not through one dramatic conversation. But through dozens of small moments. Dad had started calling me every Wednesday, not because he needed advice, but because he genuinely wanted to know how my week had been. Mom no longer apologized every time she asked me to come over. She simply said, "We'd love to see you." And somehow, those 5 words meant more than she probably realized. Sophie and I had fallen into a comfortable rhythm too. Some weekends we met for coffee before running errands together. Other Saturdays we spent hours at the lake cabin, sorting through old boxes Grandpa had stored in the attic years before. We laughed more than we talked. It felt easy. Like we were finally becoming sisters instead of competing for a place neither of us had wanted. A week before Christmas, Mom called with an unusual request. Can everyone come over a little earlier this year? Of course. Your father has something he wants to do. I smiled. Is everything okay? I think so. Her voice carried excitement instead of worry. I think you're going to like it. Christmas morning arrived with a light blanket of snow covering the neighborhood. As I pulled into my parents' driveway, I noticed something that immediately made me smile. The old wooden sled Grandpa had built decades earlier was leaning against the front porch. Dad must have taken it out of storage. He knew how much Grandpa loved seeing the grandchildren use it every winter. Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon, fresh coffee, and pine. The Christmas tree stood in the living room, decorated with many of the same handmade ornaments we'd created as children. Some were crooked. Some had faded over the years. Mom had kept every one of them. You're here, she said, wrapping me in a hug. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas, Mom. A few minutes later, Sophie arrived carrying 2 pies and far too many wrapped gifts. You bought all these? She laughed. I got carried away. Again. Dad walked into the room wearing one of Grandpa's old Christmas sweaters. The sleeves were slightly too short now, but he wore it proudly. I figured he'd complain if I left it hanging in the closet another year. We all laughed. For the first time in years, the laughter reached every corner of the room. After breakfast, Dad stood beside the Christmas tree holding a small envelope. I've got one more present. He looked directly at me. This one's for Olivia. I frowned. You didn't have to. I know. He smiled gently. But I wanted to. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside wasn't a gift card, or money, or jewelry. It was a framed newspaper clipping. At first, I didn't recognize it. Then I saw the headline. Local student named valedictorian. The article was about my high school graduation. There was a photograph of me standing at the podium, smiling as I accepted my diploma. I looked closer. Someone had carefully preserved it all these years. Dad cleared his throat. I found it in your mother's keepsake box. His voice trembled. I realized something. I looked up. I missed that day. He paused. But I don't want to spend the rest of my life missing the daughter who stood on that stage. The room became silent. I can't go back. I can't change the choices I made. He swallowed hard. But I can spend whatever time we have left making different ones. Tears filled my eyes before I could stop them. I stood and hugged him. This time, neither of us let go quickly. Around us, Mom quietly wiped away tears. Sophie smiled through her own. Outside, snow continued falling gently over the old family home. Inside, something far more meaningful had finally arrived. Not a perfect family. Not a family without mistakes. But a family that had finally learned that love isn't measured by what we promise to leave behind. It's measured by the people we choose to see while we still have the chance. A few days after Christmas, I received another unexpected phone call. It was Mr. Whitmore. Good morning, Olivia. Good morning. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. I was wondering if you might have time for lunch. I smiled. That's a first. He laughed softly. I suppose it is. There are a few things your grandfather asked me to share. They're not legal matters. They're simply stories. I'd love that. We met at the small diner Grandpa used to visit every Friday afternoon. The owner still remembered him. As soon as we walked inside, she smiled warmly. Charles. It's been a while. It has. She looked toward me. And you must be Olivia. I smiled. How did you know? She laughed. Your grandfather talked about you constantly. I wasn't sure how to respond. Somehow, hearing that from a stranger meant more than I expected. We settled into Grandpa's favorite booth near the window. The waitress brought 2 coffees without asking. Same as always. Mr. Whitmore smiled. Some traditions shouldn't change. For a while, we talked about ordinary things. Work. The weather. The renovations at the lake cabin. Then Mr. Whitmore reached into his briefcase and removed a small notebook. The leather cover was worn from years of use. I've been waiting to give you this. I carefully accepted it. What is it? Your grandfather's journal. I looked at him in surprise. He kept a journal. Not every day. Only when something important happened. I slowly opened the first page. The handwriting was instantly familiar. Neat. Patient. Steady. The first entry wasn't about business. Or investments. It was about Grandma. Another page described the day Dad was born. Another talked about rebuilding the factory after a fire decades earlier. Then I reached an entry dated 16 years ago. Today Olivia came over after school. She spent 3 hours helping me organize tax records. She never complained once. Most children her age would rather be anywhere else. She reminds me that quiet people often carry the strongest hearts. My eyes lingered on the page. Mr. Whitmore simply waited. There are dozens of entries like that. He smiled. He noticed everything. I continued reading. There were stories about Sophie too. About how she'd convinced Grandpa to dance at her 8th grade talent show. About her generosity. Her humor. Her ability to make lonely people feel included. Grandpa had loved us both deeply. Just differently. I closed the journal. I always thought he saw something special in me. Mr. Whitmore smiled gently. He did. But not because you were perfect. I looked at him. He admired your consistency. He once told me, Mr. Whitmore paused. That talent impresses people. But character earns trust. Those words settled quietly between us. They're different things. He nodded. Exactly. Before we left the diner, Mr. Whitmore looked out the window toward the old town square. You know, he smiled. Your grandfather used to say one sentence over and over. What was it? He laughed softly. One generation plants trees. The next generation decides whether they become a forest. I looked down at Grandpa's journal resting in my hands. For years, I had believed he left me responsibility. Now I realized he'd left me something even greater. Perspective. As I drove home that afternoon, I couldn't stop thinking about those words. Grandpa had spent his entire life planting seeds he knew he might never see grow. Now it was my turn. Not because he expected perfection, but because he believed every generation had the chance to leave the next one a little stronger than they had found it. New Year's Eve arrived with a quiet snowfall that covered the lake cabin in white. For the first time in years, our entire family decided to celebrate there instead of staying in town. The cabin still wasn't finished. Fresh paint covered only half the porch. The kitchen cabinets had been replaced, but the old wooden floors still creaked with every step. Dad insisted those would never be changed. Your grandfather laid these boards himself, he said. They've earned the right to squeak. We all laughed. Some things were worth preserving exactly as they were. That afternoon, while everyone unpacked groceries and decorated the fireplace, I wandered into the old workshop behind the cabin. The room hadn't changed much since Grandpa passed away. His workbench still stood beneath the window. Coffee cans filled with old screws lined the shelves. His favorite hammer rested exactly where he'd left it. Dust covered almost everything, except one small wooden box sitting in the center of the bench. I frowned. I didn't remember seeing it before. Curious, I lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of handwritten index cards, each carefully labeled with a year. The earliest one was dated nearly 30 years ago. I picked it up. On one side was a single sentence. This year I learned patience. I reached for another. This year I learned that apologizing quickly saves relationships. Another. This year I learned money solves fewer problems than kindness. Another. This year I learned children remember our time more than our gifts. I smiled. It felt exactly like something Grandpa would create. A lifetime of lessons. One sentence at a time. Found something? Dad's voice came from the doorway. I turned around. I think so. He walked over and looked inside the box. His eyes immediately softened. I haven't seen these in years. You knew about them? He nodded. Dad started writing one card every New Year's Eve after I graduated high school. He picked up one carefully. He said memories fade. But lessons shouldn't. We stood quietly reading them together. One card after another. No complaints. No regrets. Just simple truths collected across an ordinary life. Finally, Dad picked up the last card. It had been written only a few months before Grandpa passed away. He handed it to me. I think this one's yours. I turned it over. The handwriting was slightly shakier than the others. This year I learned that the greatest success isn't leaving something valuable behind. It's leaving people who know how to value each other. Neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was grateful. Later that evening, just before midnight, our family gathered outside on the cabin porch. Snowflakes drifted quietly across the frozen lake while distant fireworks colored the sky. Mom handed everyone a mug of hot chocolate. Sophie wrapped herself in an old blanket Grandma had sewn decades earlier. Dad looked across the lake before quietly clearing his throat. I'd like to start a new tradition. We all looked toward him. Every New Year's Eve. He smiled. I'd like each of us to share one lesson we learned that year. Sophie laughed. So, we're copying Grandpa? Dad grinned. Without shame. She nodded. I like that. When my turn came, I looked across the peaceful lake before answering. This year. I smiled. I learned that forgiveness isn't forgetting the past. It's choosing not to let the past decide the future. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Dad quietly nodded. I think your grandfather would have been proud of that. As midnight arrived and the new year quietly began, I looked around at the people standing beside me. A few months earlier, I believed my family had chosen property over love. Now I understood something much deeper. Grandpa's greatest legacy had never been hidden inside legal documents or investment accounts. It had always been hidden inside the values he patiently planted in each of us. And at last, those seeds were finally beginning to grow. Winter slowly gave way to spring, and before any of us realized it, nearly 6 months had passed since Sophie's birthday. The family business was steadily improving. Sales had begun climbing again. The new operations manager had introduced changes that none of us would have considered a year earlier, and the employees had embraced them far more quickly than anyone expected. Dad no longer tried to solve every problem himself. Instead, he walked the factory floor every morning, asking questions instead of giving orders. It suited him. More importantly, it made the people around him feel heard. Watching him change had become one of the quiet joys of my life. One Tuesday afternoon, I was finishing a meeting with one of our largest clients when my assistant appeared outside my office. Olivia? Yes. There's someone here asking for you. I don't have another meeting. I know. He says he doesn't have an appointment. I frowned. Did he give his name? She nodded. Thomas Reynolds. The name meant nothing to me. I'll be right out. A man in his early 70s stood near the reception desk, holding a weathered leather briefcase. His silver hair was neatly combed, and despite the expensive suit he wore, there was something remarkably humble about him. When our eyes met, he smiled. You must be Olivia. I am. He extended his hand. My name is Thomas Reynolds. I worked with your grandfather for almost 25 years. The moment he mentioned Grandpa, my curiosity replaced my confusion. It's nice to meet you. I wish the circumstances were different. What do you mean? He glanced toward the conference rooms. Would you mind if we spoke somewhere private? A few minutes later, we sat across from each other with 2 cups of coffee between us. Thomas rested both hands on his briefcase before speaking. I've been looking for you. For me? He nodded. I've been traveling overseas for the better part of 3 years. I only recently learned your grandfather had passed. I'm sorry I wasn't here. I smiled gently. He always spoke kindly about his friends. Thomas looked down for a moment. He was the best man I've ever known. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then he slowly opened the briefcase. Inside was a thick folder tied together with an old blue ribbon. I've been keeping this. What is it? He slid the folder toward me. Your grandfather asked me to deliver it to you. I looked at him in surprise. When? The last time I saw him. About 6 months before he passed. I carefully untied the ribbon. Inside were handwritten letters, old photographs, business notes, and a faded black and white picture of Grandpa standing beside a younger man I immediately recognized. Thomas. We started our first company together. Thomas smiled. We were 24. We had no money, no experience, and more confidence than common sense. I laughed. That sounds like Grandpa. It absolutely does. Thomas reached into the folder and removed one final envelope. Unlike the others, this one had never been opened. My name was written across the front. Just below it were 7 words that immediately stopped me. For Olivia, when she no longer needs me. I stared at the handwriting. Even after all these months, seeing Grandpa's words still felt like hearing his voice. Thomas smiled quietly. He spent years preparing you. I nodded. I know. He gently pushed the envelope closer. I think. He paused before finishing. He also knew there would come a day when you wouldn't need instructions anymore. I looked down at the unopened envelope resting in my hands. For the first time since Grandpa's final letter had been revealed, I realized he might still have one last lesson waiting for me. I didn't open the envelope immediately. Instead, I turned it over in my hands. tracing Grandpa's familiar handwriting with my thumb. For Olivia, when she no longer needs me. Those 7 words carried more emotion than an entire page ever could. Thomas noticed my hesitation. He didn't want you to rush. I smiled faintly. That sounds like him. He made me promise something. What was that? That I'd never encourage you to open it. He said. Thomas chuckled softly. She'll know when she's ready. I looked out the conference room window toward the busy street below. For so many years, Grandpa had been my quiet compass. Every difficult decision somehow led back to one of his lessons. But lately, without realizing it, I had stopped asking myself what Grandpa would do. I had started asking what I believed was right. Maybe that was exactly what he had been preparing me for all along. I carefully broke the seal. Inside was only one handwritten page. No legal documents. No hidden instructions. No financial records. Just a letter. I unfolded it slowly. My dear Olivia, if you're reading this, then I hope something wonderful has happened. I hope you've reached the point where you no longer spend your life trying to earn someone else's approval. I stopped reading. A quiet smile crossed my face. Somehow, he already knew. I continued. When you were little, you asked me why oak trees grow so slowly. Do you remember what I told you? I laughed softly. I do. Thomas looked curious. What did he say? I smiled. He said anything worth trusting takes time. Thomas nodded. That sounds exactly like him. I returned to the letter. People spend too much of life chasing applause. Applause is loud. Character grows quietly. Never mistake one for the other. The words settled gently into my heart. Not because they were new. Because I was finally old enough to understand them. The next paragraph caught me completely off guard. I have one final request. When someone disappoints you, try to understand them before you judge them. Understanding won't always erase the hurt, but it will keep the hurt from becoming bitterness. I thought about Dad, about Sophie's birthday, about everything that had happened since. A year earlier, those words would have felt impossible. Today, they felt true. I reached the final page. One day people may tell you that I changed your life. Don't believe them. I simply reminded you of the person you already were. My vision blurred. Everything good you've built, you built through thousands of ordinary choices. Don't ever give me credit for your courage. It always belonged to you. The final sentence was only 6 words. Live well. Love people. That's enough. There was no signature. There didn't need to be. I carefully folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. Neither Thomas nor I spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, he smiled. So, what did your grandfather leave you this time? I looked down at the envelope before answering. Freedom. He raised an eyebrow. Freedom? I nodded. For years, I thought he was teaching me how to carry responsibility. I smiled quietly. I just realized. He was also teaching me when to stop carrying guilt. Thomas stood and extended his hand. I think he'd be proud of that answer. As we walked toward the office lobby together, I felt strangely lighter. Not because Grandpa had left me another secret, but because, for the first time since losing him, I no longer felt like I was walking through life trying to follow his footsteps. I was finally walking beside the values he had planted in me all along. Thomas left my office just before noon. For several minutes, I remained seated, staring at Grandpa's final letter resting on my desk. I didn't read it again. I didn't need to. Some letters aren't meant to be memorized. They're meant to become part of the way you live. Eventually, I slipped it into my briefcase and returned to work. The afternoon was filled with meetings, phone calls, and spreadsheets waiting for my attention. On the surface, everything looked ordinary. Inside, however, something had shifted. Grandpa had spent years preparing me to lead. Now he was quietly encouraging me to let others lead beside me. That thought stayed with me all week. Friday afternoon brought another trustee meeting. Rachel was already arranging documents when I walked into the conference room. Good timing, she said with a smile. We've got something new. I took my usual seat. What is it? She slid a thin folder across the table. This isn't a request for financial assistance. I looked at the cover. Community Education Proposal. I opened it. The proposal had been submitted by the principal of Lincoln High School, the same public school I had graduated from years earlier. The school's vocational education program was in danger of closing after losing state funding. Without additional support, hundreds of students would lose access to programs in engineering, skilled trades, computer technology, and healthcare. I slowly read every page. Many of those students came from families that couldn't afford private education. For some of them, those programs were their best chance at building a career. Rachel quietly watched me. What are you thinking? I smiled. I'm thinking Grandpa would have read every page twice. She laughed. He usually did. The proposal included letters from teachers, local business owners, and former students. One letter immediately caught my attention. It was written by an auto shop owner. 5 of my best employees came through this program. Without it, they never would have discovered what they were capable of. Another came from a nurse who had once completed the school's medical assistant training. That class changed my life. Today I supervise 23 nurses because one teacher believed in me before I believed in myself. I closed the folder for a moment. Something about those words felt familiar. Not because our stories were identical. Because someone had believed in me long before I truly believed in myself. Grandpa. Professor Daniels. My first manager. Life had been full of people quietly opening doors without asking for recognition. Maybe this was my opportunity to do the same for someone else. The trustee committee gathered the following Tuesday. After reviewing the proposal, Rachel looked toward me. This doesn't technically fall under family assistance. I know. The trust charter allows educational initiatives under one condition. She smiled. That they create opportunities extending beyond a single individual. I nodded. This qualifies. One committee member leaned forward. Why? I answered without looking at my notes. Because helping one student changes one life. I paused. Helping a school changes generations. The room became quiet. Then one by one, heads began to nod. The vote was unanimous. The Carter Legacy Trust would provide the funding needed to keep the vocational education program open for another 5 years. A month later, the school invited the trustees to a small ceremony announcing the partnership. I almost declined. Grandpa had never enjoyed public recognition. Then I remembered something else he used to say. If showing up encourages someone else, go. So I went. The auditorium was filled with students, teachers, and parents. The principal stepped to the podium. Today isn't simply about funding. She smiled toward the audience. It's about believing that young people deserve opportunities before they've had a chance to prove themselves. Those words settled deep inside me. I realized that was exactly what Grandpa had done. He hadn't trusted me because I had already accomplished everything. He had trusted me because he believed in the person I was becoming. As the students applauded, I quietly looked toward the empty chair beside the stage. For just a moment, I could almost imagine Grandpa sitting there with his familiar smile. Happy not because anyone knew his name, but because the future he had quietly planted was beginning to bloom far beyond our own family. The school ceremony ended with students gathering around the teachers who had fought so hard to save the vocational program. Some thanked them with handshakes. Others with hugs. A few simply stood nearby, smiling because they didn't know how to express what the opportunity meant. I stayed toward the back of the auditorium. Recognition had never been the purpose. Watching hope return to that room was enough. As people slowly began leaving, the principal walked over. Miss Bennett. I smiled. Please, call me Olivia. She nodded. Olivia. There's someone I'd like you to meet. She motioned toward a young man standing near the stage. He looked no older than 18. His hands were tucked nervously into the pockets of an old jacket. This is Caleb. The young man stepped forward. It's nice to meet you. You too. The principal smiled. Caleb is one of the students whose future changed today. He looked down for a moment before speaking. My dad lost his job last year. My mom works nights at the hospital. I was planning to leave school after graduation and take whatever job I could find. He hesitated. I didn't think college was possible. I listened quietly. The engineering program here, he smiled for the first time, is the only reason I believed I had a chance. His voice cracked slightly. I just wanted to say thank you. Before I could answer, he reached into his backpack and handed me a folded piece of paper. I wrote this yesterday. I wasn't sure if I'd ever get to give it to anyone. After another quiet thank you, he joined his parents near the auditorium doors. I unfolded the letter. The handwriting was uneven, but every word felt sincere. To whoever believed in students they've never met. Thank you for believing in us before we've had a chance to prove ourselves. One day, I hope someone looks at my work and says it helped make life better for someone else. If that ever happens, I'll remember today. I slowly folded the letter again. For several seconds, I couldn't move. Then I understood. Grandpa had never been investing only in buildings, or businesses, or markets. He had always been investing in people. The trust had simply become another way to continue that work. Driving home that evening, I took the long route through town. The spring sun hung low over the horizon, casting long shadows across familiar streets. I passed my old elementary school, the public library where Grandpa used to take me every Saturday afternoon, the diner where we'd shared pancakes after my first promotion. Every place carried a memory, not of extraordinary moments, of ordinary ones, the kind that quietly shape an entire life without anyone realizing it. When I reached my apartment, I placed Caleb's letter inside Grandpa's journal. It felt like the right place for it. One generation's lesson beside another generation's hope. That night, I stood by the living room window watching the city lights flicker to life. Months earlier, I had walked away from my parents' house believing I had lost something. Their approval. Their confidence. Perhaps even my place in the family. Now I realized something remarkable. The moment that once felt like the greatest disappointment of my life had quietly become the beginning of everything that mattered most. If Dad had never made that announcement, I might never have opened Grandpa's letter. I might never have understood the trust. I might never have discovered the purpose Grandpa had been preparing me to carry. Sometimes life doesn't change because everything goes according to plan. Sometimes it changes because the moment that breaks your heart also points you toward the person you were always meant to become. Standing there in the quiet of my apartment, I smiled to myself. For the first time since this journey began, I wasn't thinking about what Grandpa had left me. I was thinking about what I would someday leave behind. Spring slowly turned into summer. Nearly a year had passed since Sophie's birthday, the day everything had seemed to fall apart. Looking back, it was hard to believe how much had changed. The business was growing again. The lake cabin had become the place where our family gathered instead of argued. The trust had funded scholarships, medical care, and opportunities Grandpa would have been proud to support. Most importantly, we had learned how to listen to one another. I thought the hardest part of our journey was behind us. I was wrong. One Saturday morning, Mom called unexpectedly. Olivia? Hi, Mom. Could you come over? Everything okay? I think so. Her voice sounded uncertain. I found something while cleaning the attic. I smiled. Another one of Grandpa's mysteries? She laughed softly. I honestly don't know. But I think you should see it. I'll be there in 30 minutes. The attic hadn't changed since I was a teenager. Old furniture sat beneath white sheets. Boxes filled with Christmas decorations lined one wall. Dust floated through thin beams of sunlight coming from the small attic window. Mom stood beside an old cedar chest. I was looking for photo albums. She pointed toward a weathered cardboard box. This was underneath. I knelt beside it. The lid was covered with faded handwriting. Family correspondence. I carefully lifted it open. Inside were dozens of neatly bundled letters tied together with string. Some were addressed to Grandpa, others to Grandma. Many were dated long before I was born. Mom picked up one bundle. I've never seen these. Neither had I. As we sorted through the letters, one envelope caught my attention. It was addressed to Grandpa. The return address belonged to someone I didn't recognize. Inside was a handwritten letter dated 34 years earlier. I quietly began reading. Dear William, I owe you an apology. I've spent years believing success meant proving I was right. Instead, I nearly lost my family. I frowned. The letter continued. You once told me that children remember how we make them feel far longer than they remember what we buy them. I didn't understand then. I do now. I slowly lowered the page. The words felt strangely familiar. Almost identical to lessons Grandpa had taught us growing up. Mom looked over my shoulder. Who wrote it? I checked the signature. Frank Morrison. She gasped quietly. My father. I looked at her in surprise. Grandpa Frank? She nodded. I never knew he wrote this. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then she whispered. My father wasn't always the man. You remember. She sat down on an old wooden chair. When I was little. Her voice became distant. He worked all the time. He missed birthdays, school plays, family dinners. He believed providing financially was enough. I listened carefully. It took him years to realize he'd been building a business while quietly losing his family. She smiled sadly. Your grandfather helped him. William. She nodded. They became friends through church. One evening they talked for hours. No one knows exactly what was said. But after that, she smiled through tears. My father started coming home early. He stopped missing birthdays. He became the grandfather you knew. I looked down at the letter again. Grandpa hadn't just changed our family. He had quietly changed others too. Without asking for recognition. Without telling anyone. Just by living the values he believed in. As I carefully placed the letter back into its envelope, I realized something that filled me with quiet gratitude. Grandpa's greatest legacy had never been limited to one family name. It had quietly reached people who would never even know how deeply he'd influenced their lives. And somehow, that made his legacy even more extraordinary. Mom and I carried the box downstairs and spread the letters across the dining room table. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, making the faded paper glow with a warmth that seemed to belong to another era. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Every envelope felt like a small piece of history waiting to be understood. Finally, Mom reached for another bundle tied together with a blue ribbon. I think these belong together. She handed them to me. The first letter had been written by Grandpa. The second was a reply from her father 6 months later. The third had never been mailed. It remained folded inside the envelope exactly as it had been left. Curious, I opened it. William, I don't know whether I'll ever have the courage to hand you this letter. You've been more of a brother to me than anyone I've ever known. You never judged me when I deserved it. You simply kept showing up. I looked toward Mom. She quietly wiped away a tear. I've never seen this. I continued reading. When my marriage nearly fell apart, you didn't tell me I was a failure. You asked me what kind of husband I still wanted to become. Nobody had ever asked me that before. The words settled heavily over both of us. Grandpa hadn't rescued people by giving speeches. He had asked better questions. The next paragraph revealed something neither of us expected. I still remember the afternoon you closed your hardware store early just to help me coach Emily's softball team. Mom looked surprised. Emily was me. I smiled. I guessed. She laughed softly through her tears. I thought Dad finally wanted to spend time with me. She looked down at the letter. I never knew it was your grandfather who convinced him. The room became quiet again. Not because we were sad. Because we were discovering a kindness Grandpa had never spoken about. He had quietly changed lives. Then stepped back so other people could receive the credit. That was exactly the kind of man he had always been. As we sorted through the remaining letters, a pattern slowly appeared. Teachers, neighbors, old employees, friends. Each letter described a different moment. A lone grandpa never expected to be repaid. A recommendation that helped someone find work. A quiet visit during a difficult illness. Advice offered without judgment. Time freely given. None of the letters mentioned the trust. None mentioned money. They all talked about something else. Presence. Grandpa had simply shown up. Again and again. For decades. Without making anyone feel like they owed him anything. Mom smiled as she folded another letter. I used to think your grandfather was extraordinary because he was wise. She looked at me. I don't think that's true anymore. No. She shook her head. I think he was extraordinary because he never got too busy to care. Those words stayed with me. In a world where everyone seemed to be rushing somewhere, Grandpa had chosen to slow down whenever another person needed him. Maybe that had been his greatest gift. Before I left that evening, Mom carefully placed all the letters back inside the cedar box. I think these belong together. I nodded. They're part of our family now. She smiled. No. She gently rested one hand on the lid. I think they're part of your grandfather's real legacy. Driving home, I couldn't stop thinking about the people whose lives had quietly intersected with Grandpa's. Many of them would never meet one another. Some had probably never known the full story. Yet each of them carried a small piece of the same kindness forward into someone else's life. Suddenly, the trust made even more sense. Grandpa hadn't created it simply to preserve wealth. He had created it to preserve a way of living. One ordinary act of compassion at a time. The following weekend, Mr. Whitmore called again. Olivia, good morning. I have a favor to ask. I smiled. You've earned at least one. He laughed softly. It isn't for me. It's for your grandfather. That immediately had my attention. What is it? Do you remember the scholarship your trust approved for Lincoln High School? Of course. They're holding a small community appreciation dinner. I'd like you to attend. I thought the trust stayed anonymous. It usually does. He paused. But this event is different. They're celebrating people who quietly helped build the community. I hesitated. I'm not sure Grandpa would have wanted attention. He wouldn't. Mr. Whitmore agreed. That's why his name isn't on the program. I smiled. Then why am I going? Because there are a few people I'd like you to meet. The dinner was held inside the Old Town Community Center. It wasn't a grand event. There were folding tables covered with white cloths, homemade desserts prepared by volunteers, and photographs lining the walls showing decades of local history. The room felt warm, comfortable, real. I noticed familiar faces almost immediately. Teachers, business owners, retired firefighters, former factory employees, people whose lives had quietly crossed paths with Grandpa over the years. None of them knew one another's stories. Not yet. After dinner, the mayor welcomed everyone. We often celebrate people who make headlines. He smiled. Tonight, we'd like to celebrate people who made neighbors feel less alone. Applause filled the room. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of calling one person to the stage, the mayor invited several guests to share short memories. The first was an elderly woman named Margaret. 30 years ago, she began, my husband passed away unexpectedly. She smiled sadly. I had 2 young boys and no idea how I'd pay the mortgage. She paused. A man from the hardware store showed up every Saturday morning. He fixed things around the house. He never accepted $1. I later learned he had children of his own waiting for him at home. She smiled through tears. William Bennett saved my family. I looked down quietly. Grandpa had never mentioned her. The next speaker was a retired teacher. When our school library flooded, he laughed softly. I thought we'd lose thousands of books. The next morning, nearly 20 volunteers arrived. I assumed the school district sent them. He shook his head. No. William Bennett organized every one of them. Again. I had never heard that story. One by one, people stood. An old mechanic. A widower. A nurse. A young father. Each story was different. Yet they all shared something remarkable. Grandpa had helped them, then disappeared before anyone could thank him. By the end of the evening, many people in the room were wiping away tears. Not because they had received money, because someone had once made them feel seen. As the gathering ended, an elderly gentleman slowly approached me. His name tag read Harold Mason. "I've been hoping I'd meet you. It's nice to meet you too." He smiled warmly. "Your grandfather spoke about you often." I laughed. "I'm beginning to hear that a lot. He told me something once." "What was it?" Harold looked toward the photographs covering the walls. He said, "One day my granddaughter will understand that success isn't measured by what people remember about you. It's measured by what they remember about themselves after spending time with you." I stood quietly. Those words settled deep inside me. They explained everything. The trust. The letters. The scholarships. The family. None of it had ever been about creating a famous name. It had always been about helping ordinary people believe their own lives mattered. As I drove home beneath a sky full of stars, I realized Grandpa had quietly accomplished something most people spend a lifetime chasing. He hadn't built a legacy people admired. He had built one people continued living. And somehow, that was far more beautiful than being remembered. A few days after the community dinner, I couldn't stop thinking about the stories people had shared. Not one of them had mentioned Grandpa's investments. Not one had talked about the trust. No one cared how much money he had left behind. They remembered how he had made them feel. That realization stayed with me all week. Then, on Friday afternoon, Dad called. "Olivia." "Hi, Dad. I was wondering." He hesitated. "Could you come by the factory tomorrow?" "Of course. Everything okay?" "I think so. I just need your opinion." "I'll be there." Saturday morning, I walked through the factory doors just after 8. The familiar sounds of machinery echoed through the building. Workers greeted Dad as they passed. What surprised me most wasn't that they respected him. It was how relaxed everyone seemed around him now. He had changed. And people noticed. He met me near the production floor. "Thanks for coming." "Always." He led me upstairs to Grandpa's old office. Almost everything looked the same. The worn wooden desk. The framed photograph of Grandpa and Grandma. The old clock that always seemed 5 minutes slow. Dad stood by the window for a long moment before speaking. "I've been reading those letters your mom found." I smiled. "They're incredible." "They are." He looked down at his hands. "I keep asking myself one question. What is it?" He turned toward me. "Why didn't Dad ever tell us about all those people he helped?" I thought about it for a moment. Maybe because helping them wasn't the story he wanted people to remember. Dad nodded slowly. "I think you're right." He opened a folder resting on the desk. Inside were employee records, performance reviews, training plans. I've been thinking about the younger people working here. I looked through the papers. Several employees had recently graduated from trade school. Others were in apprenticeship programs. They remind me of myself. Dad smiled. Eager. A little uncertain. Trying to prove they belong. He paused. "I don't want them spending years wondering if anyone believes in them." His words caught me off guard. "You've been thinking about your own childhood. And yours." He answered honestly. "I can't change what happened. But maybe I can stop someone else from feeling the way you did." A lump formed in my throat. That was exactly what Grandpa had done. He had transformed his own lessons into someone else's opportunities. Dad sat down across from me. "I want to start a mentorship program here." I smiled. "For new employees?" He nodded. "No one's promoted until they've helped someone else grow." I laughed softly. "That sounds familiar." "It should." He grinned. "It's exactly what Dad would have done." He pointed toward the factory floor below. "I've spent years measuring success by production numbers. Now, He looked out the window. I want to measure it by how many people leave this place more confident than when they arrived. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I quietly said, I think Grandpa would be smiling right now. Dad smiled back. I hope so. As I prepared to leave, one of the youngest apprentices hurried into the office. Mr. Bennett. Dad looked up. Yes. I just wanted to thank you. For what? The young man smiled nervously. You stayed after work yesterday to help me learn the new equipment. He shrugged. My dad never had time to teach me things like that. Dad stood silently. I didn't realize how much it meant. The apprentice smiled again before heading back downstairs. After the door closed, Dad looked at me with tears quietly filling his eyes. I finally understand. What? He smiled through those tears. Your grandfather never wanted to be remembered for what he built. He wanted the people around him to become builders too. As I walked out of the factory that morning, I looked back one last time. For years, that building had produced products. Now, it was beginning to produce something far more valuable. People who believed in one another. And I realized that was the moment Grandpa's greatest dream had truly come to life. Nearly 2 years had passed since Sophie's birthday. If someone had asked me back then where our family would be today, I never could have imagined this. The business was healthier than it had been in years. The mentorship program Dad had created had become one of the company's proudest achievements. Employee turnover had dropped dramatically. Several apprentices had already been promoted into leadership roles. The lake cabin was full again. Not with arguments. With birthdays, fishing trips, holiday dinners, children running through the same woods where Sophie and I had once played. Grandpa would have loved seeing it. Sometimes I could almost picture him sitting quietly on the porch, pretending not to smile while watching everyone else laugh. One Monday morning, Rachel called just before lunch. Olivia. Hi, Rachel. I've received something unusual. What is it? A purchase offer. I frowned. For what? The family business. I sat up straighter. Someone wants to buy it. She sighed. Not just someone. She named one of the largest manufacturing corporations in the country. I recognized the company immediately. They've been acquiring regional businesses for years. They have. They're offering well above market value. How much? There was a brief pause. The preliminary offer is $28 million. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The number wasn't just large, it was life-changing. They've requested a meeting. When? This Friday. I thanked her and slowly set my phone down. That evening, our family gathered around the same dining table where Grandpa's letters had first been opened. The atmosphere felt completely different now. There was no tension. Only uncertainty. Dad carefully slid the proposal across the table. They want everything. The factory. The equipment. The brand. The land. Sophie quietly turned the pages. They'd keep the employees. For at least 2 years. Dad answered. After that. He shrugged. They make no promises. The room grew silent. $28 million. It was more money than any of us had ever imagined. Mom looked around the table. What does everyone think? No one answered immediately, because we all knew this decision wasn't really about money. Finally, Sophie spoke. A year ago. She smiled sadly. I would have told Dad to sell. She looked around the room. Now I'm not so sure. Dad nodded slowly. I understand. He looked toward me. What about you? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I thought about Grandpa. Not his investments. Not the trust. His lessons. I looked at the proposal once more. Then quietly asked a question. What happens to the people? Dad looked surprised. The employees. Yes. Their families. The apprentices. The mentorship program. The community. What happens to them? No one spoke. Because suddenly, $28 million didn't seem like the most important part of the conversation. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, I stood alone outside the factory. The building looked almost exactly as it had when Grandpa first showed it to me as a little girl. Back then, I thought it was just a place where people worked. Now I understood it was much more than that. It was where fathers taught sons, where daughters learned confidence, where young people discovered careers, where friendships quietly lasted decades. Buildings could be sold, machines could be replaced, but communities, those were much harder to rebuild. As I looked through the factory windows, I realized Grandpa had prepared us for one final test. Not whether we could protect what he built, but whether we understood why he built it in the first place. Friday morning arrived with clear skies and an unusual sense of anticipation. At exactly 9 o'clock, 3 black SUVs pulled into the factory parking lot. A group of executives stepped out, each carrying leather portfolios and wearing the kind of confidence that came from closing deals worth millions of dollars. Dad stood beside me at the front entrance. "You nervous?" he asked. "A little." He smiled. "So am I." It was the first time I'd ever heard him admit that before an important meeting. Years ago, he would have hidden it. Now, honesty had become one of his greatest strengths. The conference room overlooked the factory floor. From the large windows, we could see employees beginning their shifts, greeting one another by name as they walked toward their workstations. The visitors noticed it too. One of them smiled politely. "You have an unusually positive culture here." Dad nodded. "We've worked hard to build it." The lead executive introduced himself. "My name is Richard Collins. We appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. We believe this acquisition could benefit everyone involved." He opened a presentation folder. For nearly an hour, his team explained their proposal. The company would receive significant investment. The equipment would be modernized. Production would increase. Shareholders would receive an excellent return. Everything sounded impressive. Everything made financial sense. When they finished, Richard folded his hands. "We're prepared to move quickly." He looked around the room. "This is an exceptional offer." No one argued. It was. Dad looked toward me before speaking. "May I ask a few questions?" "Of course." "What happens after the 2-year employment guarantee ends?" Richard answered professionally. "That depends on business performance." "So," Dad continued, "if profits fall?" The executive hesitated. "We would make whatever operational decisions become necessary." Everyone in the room understood what that meant. Layoffs, department closures, restructuring. Richard quickly continued. "That's standard business practice." I quietly leaned forward. "I have a question too." He smiled. "Please." I opened the folder in front of me. "Your proposal values our equipment, our property, our contracts." He nodded. "It does." I looked directly at him. "Where have you valued the mentorship program?" He seemed confused. "I'm sorry." "The apprenticeship program, the employee education fund, the leadership training, the scholarships. They aren't listed anywhere." He glanced through the proposal. "Those programs don't directly affect the valuation." I smiled politely. "That's what I thought." The room became noticeably quieter. I wasn't trying to challenge him. I genuinely wanted an answer. Richard finally spoke. "Our responsibility is to evaluate measurable assets." I nodded. "I understand. But what about the things that can't be measured?" He didn't answer immediately. Neither could anyone else. Because there wasn't an easy answer. Dad slowly stood and walked toward the window overlooking the factory floor. Down below, one of the senior technicians was patiently teaching a new apprentice how to operate a machine Grandpa had purchased decades earlier. The younger employee laughed after making a mistake. The older man simply smiled and showed him again. Dad watched quietly before turning back toward the executives. "My father started this company 42 years ago." Richard nodded respectfully. "We know. He always said we weren't in the manufacturing business." The executives exchanged puzzled looks. "We weren't." Dad smiled. "We were in the people business. We just happened to manufacture products." Silence settled across the room. Then he continued. 4 years. I forgot that. I focused on numbers, growth, competition. I almost lost everything that actually mattered. He looked toward me for a brief moment before facing the executives again. I won't make that mistake twice. Richard remained calm. Are you declining the offer? Dad looked around the conference room. Then toward me. Then toward Sophie. Finally, he smiled. We haven't made our decision yet. But before we decide, he placed both hands on the conference table. We need to answer one question. What kind of future are we trying to build? For the first time that morning, no one in the room was thinking about $28 million. They were thinking about something money could never buy. After the executives left, no one rushed to speak. The conference room suddenly felt much larger than it had an hour earlier. The proposal still rested on the table. $28 million. It was enough to change every one of our lives. Yet somehow, it no longer felt like the most important thing in the room. Dad remained standing by the window. I've spent my entire career believing bigger always meant better. He smiled sadly. I don't believe that anymore. Mom folded the proposal closed. So what do we do? No one answered immediately. Not because we lacked ideas. Because we understood this decision deserved patience. Grandpa had never made life-changing choices in a single afternoon. Neither would we. The following Monday, our family met again. This time there were no attorneys, no consultants, no executives. Just the 4 of us sitting around Grandpa's old conference table. Dad looked at Sophie. I want to hear your opinion first. She smiled. A year ago, that would have surprised me. It surprises me too, Dad admitted. But I'm learning. Sophie looked down at her notes. I've thought about this every day. She took a slow breath. The offer is generous. It would make our lives easier. She paused. But easier isn't always better. Dad quietly nodded. I agree. She continued. I keep thinking about the employees. Some have worked here longer than I've been alive. They trusted our family. I don't want our last decision to be treating them like numbers. No one interrupted her. She was speaking from her heart. Dad then turned toward Mom. What about you? She smiled softly. I married into this business. I've watched 3 generations walk through these doors. She looked around the room. I've watched employees become grandparents. I've watched teenagers grow into managers. I've watched people stay here for 30 years because they believed this company cared about them. She folded her hands. If we sell. She hesitated. I don't know if that disappears. But I know we'll never be able to rebuild it. Her words settled quietly over the room. Trust took decades to build. One signature could erase it. Finally, everyone looked at me. I had spent the weekend reviewing every page of the proposal. Financially, it was excellent. Professionally, many advisors would have recommended accepting it. But Grandpa had taught me something numbers could never measure. I looked toward the factory floor below. Employees were beginning another shift. Some laughed as they walked inside. Others carried lunchboxes decorated by young children. One older supervisor stopped to help a new apprentice lift a heavy toolbox before either of them continued toward the production line. None of them knew what was being discussed upstairs. They simply trusted us. I turned back toward my family. I don't think this decision is about whether the offer is fair. Dad nodded. I agree. I think it's about whether selling would allow this place to keep serving the purpose Grandpa built it for. Silence filled the room. Then I quietly continued. He never wanted the factory to become the biggest. He wanted it to become the kind of place where people built honest lives. I smiled gently. If we can still do that. I rested my hand on the proposal. Then I don't think we're finished. Dad slowly closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were filled with quiet certainty. For the first time in many years, he wasn't making a decision alone. He was making it with his family. And somehow, That told me we were already giving Grandpa the answer he would have hoped for all along. The following Friday, the executives returned. This time, there were fewer presentations and fewer formalities. Everyone already understood the numbers. What remained was the decision. Richard Collins greeted us with the same professional smile. "I hope you've had enough time to consider the proposal." Dad nodded. "We have." The executives took their seats around the conference table while our family sat together on the opposite side. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It simply carried the weight of what was about to happen. Richard folded his hands. "We're prepared to increase our offer if necessary." Dad smiled politely. "This isn't about the price." Richard seemed surprised. "It isn't." Dad slowly shook his head. "No." He looked toward the factory floor through the conference room window. 2 years ago, I probably would have signed these papers without hesitation. He laughed quietly. I would have called it good business. Richard waited patiently. "But 2 years ago," Dad continued, "I hadn't yet learned the difference between building a successful company and building a meaningful one." The room fell silent again. I watched the executives carefully. None of them appeared offended. If anything, they seemed genuinely curious. Richard finally asked, "So, may I ask what you've decided?" Dad looked toward me, then toward Mom, then Sophie. "Finally," he answered, "we're not selling." No one celebrated. No one applauded. It simply felt like the right sentence at the right time. Richard nodded respectfully. "I appreciate your honesty. I have to admit." He smiled slightly. "I wasn't expecting that answer." Dad returned the smile. "Neither was I." Richard gathered his papers but didn't stand. "Can I ask one final question?" "Of course." "What changed your mind?" Dad looked around the room before answering. "My father." Richard glanced toward the old photograph hanging on the wall. "The founder." Dad nodded. "For years, I believed he left me a business. He didn't. He left me a responsibility." He looked toward the production floor again. "I almost forgot that." Richard followed his gaze. Employees moved between workstations, laughing as they worked together. An older machinist patiently explained something to a young apprentice. A supervisor stopped to congratulate a woman who had just completed her certification program. Life continued below us. Ordinary, steady, human. Dad smiled. "This company doesn't just manufacture products. It gives people a place to build careers, to raise families, to discover confidence. If I sell it simply because someone offered enough money," he gently rested one hand on the proposal, "then I'll be selling something that never truly belonged to me." Richard remained quiet for several seconds. Then, unexpectedly, he closed his briefcase. "I respect that." He stood and extended his hand. "I've negotiated acquisitions for almost 20 years. This is the first time I've left disappointed." He smiled warmly, and genuinely happy for the people saying no. Dad shook his hand firmly. "Thank you." As the executives walked toward the exit, Richard stopped one last time. "If you ever change your mind." Dad smiled. "We won't." Richard laughed. "I had a feeling." After they left, our family stood together in the conference room. No one said much. There wasn't anything left to say. The decision had been made. Dad slowly walked toward Grandpa's photograph hanging on the wall. He looked at it for a long time before speaking. "I spent years trying to build something people would admire." He smiled softly. "You spent your life building something people could belong to." He turned toward us. "I finally understand the difference." I felt tears gathering in my eyes. Not because we had turned down $28 million. Because, for the first time in my life, I realized our family's greatest achievement had never been the business. It wasn't the trust. It wasn't the property. It was that we had finally become the kind of family Grandpa believed we could be. And somehow, that was worth far more than anything money could ever buy. A few weeks after we declined the offer, life settled into its familiar rhythm once again. The factory continued moving forward. Orders increased. New apprentices joined the mentorship program. The trust approved another round of educational scholarships. On the surface, everything looked ordinary. But inside our family, something extraordinary had quietly taken root. We trusted each other. Not because we always agreed, because we had finally learned how to listen. One Saturday evening, Dad called. "Olivia." "Hi, Dad. Could you come by the house tomorrow morning?" "Sure. Everything okay?" He chuckled softly. "Everything's better than okay. I just want to talk." There was something peaceful in his voice. Not urgency. Not worry. Just peace. "I'll be there." The next morning, I found him sitting alone on the back porch with 2 cups of coffee. The backyard looked exactly as it had on Sophie's birthday nearly 2 years earlier. The same flower beds. The same wooden fence. The same oak tree Grandpa had planted decades ago. So much was familiar. Yet everything felt different. Dad smiled as I sat beside him. "I've been thinking." I laughed. "That usually leads somewhere interesting." It does. For several moments, we simply watched birds gathering near the old bird feeder Grandpa had built. Finally, Dad spoke. "Do you remember your high school graduation?" I smiled gently. "I remember all of it." He nodded slowly. "So do I." His eyes remained fixed on the yard. I wasn't really there. No. I was already thinking about Michael's championship game. He looked down into his coffee. "I've replayed that day hundreds of times." I stayed quiet. He didn't need interruptions. He needed room. "I spent years believing I had failed you because I missed important moments." He paused. "I finally realized. I failed you long before that." He looked at me. "I failed to make you feel seen." Those words landed deeper than any apology he'd offered before. Because they weren't rehearsed. They were honest. I kept telling myself you were strong. You were independent. You didn't need as much encouragement. He smiled sadly. "The truth is, every child needs to know they're enough." A tear slipped quietly down my cheek. Dad noticed. "I'm sorry." I shook my head. "No." He frowned. "No." I smiled through my tears. "If you'd said those words 2 years ago, I would have needed them." He listened carefully. "But today," I placed my hand over his. "I simply appreciate them." He looked at me with quiet confusion. "What changed?" I thought about Grandpa. The trust. The letters. The factory. The students. The family. Everything. I stopped measuring my worth by what I didn't receive. He nodded slowly. "And started measuring it by what you chose to give." I smiled. "No. By what I chose to become." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Dad laughed softly. "You know what? I think your grandfather would have answered exactly the same way before I left." Dad reached into his jacket pocket and handed me a small brass key. I looked at it curiously. "What's this?" He smiled. "The old workshop at the lake cabin. I've decided it belongs to you." I started to object. "Dad." He gently shook his head. "I'm not giving you a building. I'm giving you the place where your grandfather taught 3 generations of this family how to become good people." He smiled warmly. "I think it's exactly where the next chapter should begin." I closed my fingers around the key. For a moment, I couldn't speak. Then I hugged him. Not because I needed his approval anymore, but because I had finally received something much more valuable. His understanding. The following weekend, I drove to the lake cabin alone. The small brass key rested in the cup holder beside me, catching the morning sunlight every time the road curved around the lake. I hadn't stopped thinking about Dad's words. "I'm not giving you a building. I'm giving you the place where your grandfather taught 3 generations of this family how to become good people." The more I thought about it, the more I realized he was right. The workshop had never been about woodworking. It had always been about wisdom. The cabin looked peaceful beneath a bright blue sky. Birds chirped from the pine trees while the lake reflected the clouds like polished glass. Everything felt still. almost as if Grandpa were quietly waiting for me to arrive. I walked around to the back of the cabin and stopped in front of the workshop door. For a long moment, I simply held the key. Then I unlocked it. The familiar scent of cedar, old tools, and sawdust welcomed me inside. Nothing had changed. Grandpa's workbench still stood beneath the window. His tools remained neatly organized. The faded calendar on the wall still showed the month before he passed away. It felt less like entering a room, and more like stepping into a memory. I slowly walked around the workshop, running my fingers across the old shelves. Every object carried a story. The hammer he'd taught me to use when I was 12. The measuring tape he insisted was more important than any expensive tool. The worn leather gloves he always forgot to replace because, according to him, good gloves should look like they've actually worked. I smiled. Some lessons never left you. Near the corner of the room sat an old oak cabinet. I opened it carefully. Inside were dozens of wooden boxes, each labeled in Grandpa's neat handwriting. Family photos, cabin repairs, garden plans. Then one small box caught my attention. It simply read, "For whoever comes next." I carefully lifted it onto the workbench. Inside wasn't money, or legal papers, or another surprise inheritance. Instead, there were notebooks. Blank notebooks. Nearly 20 of them. On top rested a handwritten note. Every family needs someone willing to remember. Write the stories. Write the lessons. Write the mistakes. Write the victories. One day someone else will need them. I smiled through unexpected tears. Even now, Grandpa wasn't asking me to preserve buildings. He was asking me to preserve values. That afternoon, I opened the first notebook. For several minutes, the page remained blank. Then I picked up Grandpa's old fountain pen, filled it with fresh ink, and began writing. Today I unlocked Grandpa's workshop for the first time. I thought I was opening an old building. Instead, I opened another chapter of our family's story. The words came easily, not because I was a writer, because I was finally recording the things that truly mattered. The kindness Dad had learned. Sophie's courage to admit the truth. Mom's quiet strength. The apprentices finding confidence. The students receiving opportunities. The trust continuing Grandpa's mission. Page after page slowly filled. Not with perfect memories. With honest ones. As the sun began setting over the lake, I closed the notebook and looked around the workshop one last time. 4 years, I believed Grandpa had trusted me with his greatest secret. Now I understood something even more meaningful. The trust. The business. The letters. They had never been the destination. They were simply tools. The real inheritance had always been the responsibility to leave the next generation a little wiser, a little kinder, and a little stronger than the one before. I locked the workshop and slipped the key into my pocket. This time, it didn't feel like I was locking something away. It felt like I was carrying its purpose forward. Summer arrived with long evenings and warm sunlight stretching across the lake. The cabin had become our favorite gathering place. Almost every month, someone suggested spending the weekend there. Sometimes it was Dad. Sometimes Sophie. Sometimes Mom simply called and said, "I've already packed lunch. Meet us at the cabin." No one needed a special occasion anymore. Being together had become reason enough. One Saturday afternoon, while everyone worked outside, I sat on the porch watching my 6-year-old nephew, Noah, race across the yard with a fishing pole nearly twice his height. He was Sophie's son. Energetic. Curious. Always asking questions. He reminded me of Grandpa in ways that made me smile. He stopped in front of me and held up a small wooden birdhouse. "Aunt Olivia?" "Yeah. Can you help me?" "Of course. I can't get the roof straight." I laughed softly. I've struggled with a few roofs myself. Together we carried the birdhouse into Grandpa's workshop. The room looked different now. Cleaner. Brighter. The notebooks Grandpa had left sat neatly on one shelf, while several new ones I'd already filled rested beside them. Noah looked around with wide eyes. "Did Great-Grandpa build all this?" "He did. Was he really good with tools? I smiled. He was. But that wasn't what made him special. Noah tilted his head. What did? I picked up a small hammer from the workbench. He knew how to help people build things. The birdhouses? No. I smiled. Confidence. Noah frowned as though trying to understand. I handed him 2 small nails. Hold these. He carefully did. What if I mess up? You probably will. He looked surprised. I will. So did I. So did your mom. So did Grandpa. He laughed. Really? Really? I showed him how to hold the hammer. The first nail bent almost immediately. His shoulders dropped. I ruined it. I gently straightened the nail with a pair of pliers. No. You learned something. We tried again. Then again. On the 4th attempt, the nail slid perfectly into place. His face lit up. I did it. You did. He wrapped his arms around me before running outside to show everyone. Watching him disappear across the yard, I suddenly remembered another afternoon many years earlier. A younger version of me. The same workshop. The same hammer. Grandpa smiling every time I made a mistake instead of criticizing me for it. That had been his gift. He made people believe they were capable before they believed it themselves. That evening, our family gathered around a fire pit near the lake. The sky slowly filled with stars while crickets sang from the tall grass. Noah proudly placed the finished birdhouse on the picnic table. I built it. Dad smiled. You certainly did. Then Noah looked at him. Great-grandpa helped too. Dad glanced toward me. Then toward the workshop. Finally, he smiled. I think you're right. Not because Grandpa had physically built the birdhouse. Because his patience had quietly continued through another generation. As we sat together watching the fire, I looked around at everyone I loved. Mom laughing with Sophie. Dad teaching Noah how to roast marshmallows without burning them. Neighbors stopping by just to say hello. Children running barefoot across the grass. 2 years earlier, I had believed my family story was about favoritism. Now I understood it had become something much greater. It had become a story about healing. About second chances. About choosing love over pride. And as I quietly watched the people around me, I realized I was no longer carrying Grandpa's legacy by myself. Without even realizing it. We all were. Autumn returned almost exactly 2 years after Sophie's birthday. The same golden leaves covered the driveway. The same cool breeze drifted across the lake. The seasons had completed their circle. And somehow, so had we. Life wasn't perfect. The business still faced challenges. The trust still required difficult decisions. Our family still disagreed sometimes. But disagreements no longer became divisions. We had learned something much more valuable than always being right. We had learned how to remain together. One Saturday morning, the entire family gathered at the lake cabin for what Dad called a small surprise. Nobody knew what he meant. Even Mom admitted he hadn't told her. After breakfast, Dad asked everyone to walk with him to the large oak tree Grandpa had planted more than 40 years earlier. Its branches stretched across the yard, casting shade over the same patch of grass where Sophie and I had played as children. Dad smiled. I've been thinking about Dad a lot. So have we, Mom answered softly. He reached into the bed of his pickup truck and carefully lifted several young oak saplings. I thought. He smiled through slightly misty eyes. It was time to plant a few more. No speeches followed. None were needed. Each member of the family picked up a shovel. Together, we dug small holes around the edge of the property. Noah insisted on helping. Even though his shovel was barely bigger than his hand. I want this one to be mine, he said proudly. Dad knelt beside him. It will be. But remember. He gently placed Noah's small hand on the young tree. You probably won't be the one who enjoys its biggest shade. Noah looked confused. Why? Dad smiled. Because some of the best things we do aren't for us. They're for people we'll never meet. I couldn't help smiling. Those words sounded so much like Grandpa that, for a moment, it felt as though he were standing beside us. After the last tree had been planted, everyone returned to the porch for lunch. While the others talked and laughed, I slipped quietly into the workshop. The notebooks rested exactly where I had left them. I opened the newest one and turned to a blank page. Then I began writing. Today we planted trees. Not because the property needed them. Because our family finally understands what Grandpa was trying to teach us. A legacy isn't something you leave when you die. It's something you build every ordinary day while you're alive. I paused for a moment before writing one final paragraph. 2 years ago, I believed I had been forgotten. Today I know I was being prepared. Prepared to forgive. Prepared to lead. Prepared to protect something far greater than money. Prepared to love people the way Grandpa loved us. I gently closed the notebook. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the trees, our family gathered on the porch one last time before heading home. Noah climbed onto Dad's lap. Sophie rested her head on Mom's shoulder. The factory was doing well. The trust continued helping families. The workshop had become a place where new memories were quietly being made. Everything Grandpa had hoped for was no longer just a dream. It was becoming our way of life. As I looked around at the people beside me, I realized something that filled my heart with gratitude. The biggest secret I had carried away from my parents' house 2 years earlier had never really been about an inheritance. It had been about discovering that the greatest wealth any family can possess is trust, compassion, forgiveness, and the courage to choose one another again and again. And that was the legacy I hoped would continue long after my own story ended.